Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg Knuckles.
I am Pac.
And I'm Milo.
And we have another great episode for you guys today. Today we're talking about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And for people listening, before you start getting nervous that this is going to be our second recent-ish episode on whether or not muscles grow more when training at longer muscle lengths, our second episode in recent times, and the millionth episode and piece of content around the internet about that topic in recent times, fear not. That is not what we're discussing. This is an episode about the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy and whether or not it's something we really even observe at all in normal resistance training interventions. So I will fully admit on the front end, this episode is mostly about a pedantic point. It's not about whether or not muscles grow more when training at long muscle lengths. It's about whether it's correct to call that stretch-mediated hypertrophy, because stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a very specific thing. But I think when people use that term, they often use it as more of a broad descriptor of a lot of things that maybe shouldn't rightly be called stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And it's not just a pedantic point, which even if it was, I still think that would be fun as an episode. I'm a fan of using language precisely in a scientific context. But it's not just that. It is also an important distinction to make, to discuss whether the effect is actually mediated by stretch, because that carries with it different implications about what sorts of hypotheses one might make about why training at longer muscle lengths might lead to more muscle growth. And it leads to different hypotheses about the type of training one might do in order to try to grow more. So yes, it's pedantry with a point, which is one of my favorite things in the world. So yeah, we're going to get into all of that in a second. But yeah, just here at the top of the episode, how are you guys doing today?
We are good. I am doing just fine. We are working on a bunch of cool things behind the scenes, both research and content related. So lots of cool stuff to look forward to.
Echoing Pac, we've been working on a lot of Stronger by Science related content, a lot of videos that are coming up soon. And we're also, in fact, not to turn this into another lengthened partial episode, but preparing to run a study in the summer on lengthened partials. So a lot of cool things behind the scenes going on, and hopefully more on the general topic of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, or maybe not in this case, and specifically lengthened partials.
Very nice. What's going on in the study? Like, what are you hoping it will add to the literature?
Sure. So to jump ahead a little bit on one of the claims made about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it's that it's only really relevant in trained lifters. And so if you think that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is what's going on with lengthened partials or lengthened training by and large, then one of the common assumptions is, well, lengthened training may or may not be beneficial in beginners, but in more advanced trainees, it certainly won't be. And so that's essentially a claim we're looking to assess a little bit. There's not too much research currently on lengthened training in trained lifters. And so we'll be conducting a study in trained lifters with at least 6 months of training experience in the summer, comparing a full range of motion approach to a lengthened partial approach, but specifically using a within participant design so as to wash out a lot of potential confounding variables like differences in sleep, stress, nutrition, etc. that could be otherwise causing the results.
That's very cool. Well, I'm excited to see and hear how that goes.
It will also be the first one on, not the first one, it will be the first one in trained individuals and upper body musculature.
Not true.
Oh, yeah.
Technically, it's a Godo
Technically, yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to litigate that again. All right. Yeah. So we'll get into the content here in a brief moment. But first, our standard plugs here at the top of the episode. So if you're listening to this, I assume that means you enjoy the show. And if so, please like and rate it on whatever podcast platform you use, whether that's leaving the thumbs up on YouTube or leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify or whatever. That really does help us out. And if you're listening to this and you're not currently subscribed to the podcast, but you like what you hear, drop us a sub, tell your friends about it, etc. It really does help us out. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you out. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. That link will be in the show notes. If you want to purchase supplements from a reliable source at great prices and make those prices even greater, head over, and I mean greater in terms of better, in terms of lower, not greater in terms of larger, just to be clear about that. Head over to bulksupplements.com and use the code SBSPOD at checkout for a 5% discount. If you would like to stay in touch with us and what's going on in the Stronger by Science universe, check out our Facebook group and subreddit. That is Stronger by Science Community on Facebook, and reddit.com/r/Stronger by Science over on Reddit. There you can chat with us about our content. We're all relatively active in those 3 places, or in those 2 places. And also, if you're just a fan of the pod, that is where we make posts soliciting questions for the episode. So at the end of this episode, you'll hear some questions about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And if you think to yourself, man, I didn't know that they were taking questions on that topic, I would have liked to ask something. Well, you would have known if you were in the Facebook group or subreddit. So head on over there. And if you would like to stay even more in touch with us, check out our newsletter. You can find it at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter, where every couple of weeks we send you high quality, informative content. We're not just spamming you with a bunch of ads. I think all of us are subscribed to too many things via email, and too many, you put your email in somewhere once and then it feels like your inbox is just inundated with marketing emails until the end of time. Very, very sensitive to that. That is not what you get from the Stronger by Science newsletter. So if you want to get, an email every couple of weeks that you actually look forward to and don't just auto delete or auto archive, it's a good thing to check out. What's up,
and
Milo?
Just to demonstrate to the listener how much value I think we're providing here, or Strong by Science in general has provided for quite a while. I'm subscribed to a newsletter, I think with 4 or 5 different email addresses, and I have a linked inbox. So every time we release a newsletter, guess what? I get it in times 4 or 5. That's how valuable I think it is, And to be honest, though, that's been the case for years and years and years now, just because Strong by Science truly doesn't spam you. And whenever they send you an email, and obviously now we send you an email, I do think we try and provide the most up-to-date scientific research, or at least nothing egregiously spammy.
That's crazy that you said that. I had the same. I had signed up with, I think, 3 or 4 emails, all linked to the main inbox. So it was times 4, baby. But yeah, I totally echo what Milo said.
It's crazy both of you say that, because the same is also true of me. Anytime I send an email out to people, I want to get it back 4 times. You put something out into the universe, and if it comes back to you, that means you have good karma. That's the secret. But you can hack the secret by putting things out into the universe via your own email newsletter, and then subscribe to the newsletter. It automatically comes back. It's free karma. Like it's the infinite karma hack. I think more people need to be aware of that. Actually, no, it's just we try to do things with our email software, and we just use my email addresses for testing purposes. So I'm subscribed to all of our stuff like 40 times. I should unsubscribe, but I don't. Whatever. It's fine.
The one
Yeah.
thing,
Oh,
sorry, the one thing that
No,
is
no,
is
go
worth noting here is that there is multiple witnesses to us being big fans of the newsletter and SPS in general, way before there was even any remote affiliation, including multiple university students when I taught at a couple of universities here in the UK, where I spammed them with, "Hey guys, Stronger by Science, that's what you should be following," just to avoid anybody saying, "Okay guys, I can see Greg sliding his card under the table while you're talking so that you can add more sauce here."
And to add even more, when I was about 15 years old, that's how time-tested Stronger by Science as a brand is in providing scientific information. When I was 15 years old, for Christmas, I asked for Stronger by Science ebooks. And that's what got me onto a newsletter. So Stronger by Science has been around. It's been doing the damn thing. So if you aren't already subscribed to a newsletter, what are you doing?
you guys are both very kind, but you're also just making me feel very old.
You're welcome.
No. Oh man. Okay. Yeah. Let's get into the episode now. So yeah, just to set the table a little bit, we are, like I said up top, and as I'm sure the title of this episode reveals, this is an episode on stretch-mediated hypertrophy. The reason this is relevant is that the idea of observing more muscle growth when training at longer muscle lengths is a topic that people are currently discussing. It's very much in the zeitgeist. And the expression stretch-mediated hypertrophy is very commonly attached to the idea. Like, hey, we see more muscle growth when people train through a full range of motion rather than partials at shortened muscle lengths, like full squats versus half squats. Why is that? Oh, well, it's stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Like you're training through longer muscle lengths with the full squat, getting a little bit of a stretch, and that's why you see more growth. It's a stretch-mediated effect. Similar with lengthened partials, which are all the rage. There's also research just comparing isometric training at longer versus shorter muscle lengths. I think a 2018 meta-analysis by Chuck, if memory serves. So yeah, there's multiple lines of evidence suggesting that muscles grow more when they're trained at longer lengths. And to explain that finding, people use the phrase stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So what we want to do in this episode is just discuss, is that right? We see more muscle growth when training at longer muscle lengths, but is that due to stretch? Is that mediated by stretch? Is stretch-mediated hypertrophy the correct term to describe that? And just up top, this is, I think, one of the first things Milo is going to talk about here. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a thing. It's something we've known about for a long time. It is something we've observed in humans. But there is still the question of, is that what is actually going on to explain why resistance training at longer muscle lengths tends to lead to more growth? And like I said at the very top of the episode, the reason that's relevant is if the effect is mediated by stretch, if we see more muscle growth when training at longer muscle lengths due to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, that carries with it clear implications. That would mean that in order for longer muscle length training to lead to more growth, it would need to induce a stretch, right? So that would therefore imply that some muscles maybe wouldn't be amenable to growing more when training at longer muscle lengths because they're difficult to stretch in a resistance training context. It would also generally lead to the hypothesis that training at longer muscle lengths shouldn't lead to more growth unless it also causes a stretch. Because how could you have a stretch-mediated effect without a significant stretch being present? Which would therefore lead to implications about maybe the ranges of motion you would need to train through in order to expect to achieve greater hypertrophy. And so, yeah, if someone is interested in the practical aspects of applying the findings related to more growth when training at longer muscle lengths, these are very practical questions. So again, this is a little bit pedantic, which is right in my fucking wheelhouse. I love it. But it is also still very practical and relevant because it influences how you might want to apply the findings of the research looking at actual hypertrophy with longer muscle length training interventions. So yeah, that's what we're doing in this episode. And that's my intro. I think take it away from here, Milo.
I think that was really solid. One thing I'd like to preface the discussion with is why we're even having this chat in the first place. So when people have been discussing lengthened training, why it may or may not lead to more hypertrophy, if you're not aware that stretch-mediated hypertrophy has some degree of history behind it as a term, like it's been around for a while, it actually first originated in the 1970s or so. If you're not aware of that, it can be very intuitive to just say, oh, training at longer muscle lengths in the more stretched position causes more growth. Therefore, it is stretch-mediated hypertrophy. But it's worth just being a little bit pedantic about nomenclature and realizing that that term has a scientific connotation and an origin that I think many people aren't aware of. So the first thing we need to do really is to delve into where did the term originate, and as an extension, whether or not that term is appropriate when describing what happens with lengthened training. Now, the research for this podcast episode was actually done in the context of writing a full article on the topic, and that will be up on Strong by Science in the next couple of weeks. So if you want more reading and more detail on all of the studies we'll mention throughout the podcast episode, keep an eye out. It'll either be out by the time this podcast is released, or it'll be out in the next few days or a week or two at the most. So it should be around quite soon. But within this podcast episode, the aim is really just to provide an overview of, first, where stretch-mediated hypertrophy originated from, and then whether or not stretch-mediated hypertrophy even occurs in humans to a meaningful extent, and then finally, just seeing whether or not the adaptations we see with stretching interventions in humans and animals even are generalizable to what we see from lifting weights, because that is also somewhat of an open question. So first, where did we first come across the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy? In around the 1970s, and the earliest study I was able to find was a study by Sola and colleagues from 1973. There might be earlier ones, but that was certainly the earliest I was able to find. There were quite a few studies utilizing animal models to investigate the effect of chronic stretch-mediated interventions on muscle mass. And so for these experiments, you often had a variety of animals stretch out one of their muscles. Frequently, they would use the anterior lat muscle, essentially, and stretch that out with some amount of weight, a stretching device, and the amount of weight typically would be relatively large, between around 10 to 35% of the animal's body weight. So we're talking about relatively high amounts of weight being used to stretch out the muscle, and the duration of stretching in these studies was frequently on the order of, at least an hour a day to frequently up to the whole day, so 24 hours per day, 4 weeks on end. And within these studies, they generally looked at muscle mass, but also things like muscle hyperplasia, or essentially the creation of new muscle fibers, which is something that's notoriously difficult to look at in the context of humans. But just to give you an idea of the overall research and what common research designs are within this data, as I mentioned earlier, one of the first studies was by Sola and colleagues in 1973. And in this study, they essentially had a within participant or within animal design, wherein they essentially took birds and specifically their anterior lat muscle, or the teres minor, and they stretched out their muscles with 1 to 200 gram weights to, one, look at the impact of the weight being used during the stretching intervention on hypertrophy, but two, another variable they manipulated was essentially controlling whether the wing was innervated, so it had functioning nerve endings that were essentially capable of making the muscle contract, versus having the muscle be denervated, so devoid of functional nerve endings that therefore allow for the muscle to actively contract. And so the idea essentially is to compare innervated muscle to denervated muscle and to see whether in denervated muscle that had its nerve endings removed and therefore is unable to actively contract, we still observe truly stretch-mediated hypertrophy, or whether there's an effect of simply the stretching intervention on hypertrophy. And the second question was, is there a difference between different weights being used for hypertrophy? And so in this study, they stretched out these bird wings with 1 to 200 gram weights, and they observed quite substantial hypertrophy of both the denervated wing and the innervated wing. Specifically, on average, we observed around 140% of an increase in muscle mass in the denervated wing and around 170% of an increase in muscle mass in the wing that still had functional nerve endings. And so what we can kind of get at through this study and through the results is how much of the increase in muscle mass is truly stretch mediated. So when you lift weights, for example, there's a few things going on. One, in order for you to actually be able to lift the weight, your muscle is contracting, producing active tension, overcoming gravity, and ta-da, you're able to lift the weight. But what if your muscle was no longer able to produce active tension? That would then essentially isolate the question of, okay, how much of the hypertrophy observed is just stretch mediated? And so in this case, it appears that around 140% of the increase in muscle mass was attributable to simply the stretch intervention. Whereas potentially the difference in hypertrophy observed between the innervated and denervated muscle was attributable to active contraction. That is to say, more so contraction-mediated hypertrophy versus stretch-mediated hypertrophy. But the bulk of the hypertrophy observed did seem to be related to the stretching intervention itself. Another thing that was noted was an increase in the total number of muscle fibers. And that's something that we don't have much, if any, direct research in humans. So it's difficult to speak about how that is in humans. But I know Greg is a big fan of this topic and has written about it a fair bit. So I'll let him give his 2 cents there.
Yeah, I'm not gonna do my full hyperplasia rant here. That would be far too far off topic. And I'm sure I've talked about this on the podcast before at some point, but yeah, there is a common statement you will see that, who knows, it may be right, but it's also far beyond what we have evidence to directly support. A common statement you'll see that drives me a little bit insane for those reasons is that hyperplasia doesn't occur in humans. So hypertrophy, increase in muscle fiber size; hyperplasia, increase in total number of muscle fibers. And yeah, in these animal models, you observe hypertrophy and hyperplasia, but a thing you will commonly hear is that, like, oh, hey, in humans, we only observe hypertrophy. Humans don't experience hyperplasia. It doesn't occur. And what would be more correct to say is hyperplasia has never been directly experimentally observed in humans. And that is true. But there's a big difference between that and saying that hyperplasia doesn't occur in humans. It's kind of like the absence of evidence doesn't necessarily imply evidence of absence type of deal. And there is a really good reason why hyperplasia hasn't been observed in humans, because the thing about lab animals is, like, you can kill them and people are chill with it. You can't do that with human research subjects. And there are there are things you need to do if you want to count the number of muscle fibers in order to determine if hyperplasia has occurred. And it just means taking the muscle. Like, you either need to kill the animal that you're getting the muscle from, or maybe just find someone like extremely chill who would be like, yeah, sure, like, you can remove one of my hamstring muscles for science. Like, no one's going to do that, but yeah, like, there's no validated technique to like precisely estimate muscle fiber number in vivo. Like, you can't take a living animal and maybe, like, give them an MRI or something and count muscle fibers from there. You can't, due to fiber growth being inhomogeneous throughout a muscle, you can't take a biopsy and compare changes in fiber size to changes in whole muscle size and like make inferences about fiber number from there. Like all of these studies that observe hyperplasia in animals undergo a training intervention, they kill the animal and take like a cross section of the muscle and one by one count every individual muscle fiber. And that is another thing with humans. We're a lot bigger than birds and mice. Like that's one of the things that is true of humans. And you got to count all of those fibers one by one. And at this point, you could maybe use like a machine vision program to like automate it. But back in the day, you're looking at a microscope and you're counting one by one by one. And I think in these avian stretch studies, if memory serves, the birds had like somewhere around 70,000 fibers per muscle that you would have to count one at a time, which is a lot. But like human biceps, for instance, have closer to like 500,000 fibers. And if you were doing like quads, like it's just bigger muscles, like number of fibers scales proportionally with that. If you want decent statistical power, say you have like 20 subjects or something, you're going to be spending months literally just like driving yourself crazy counting fibers. And, you know, that's assuming what is it? The Declaration of Helsinki goes away and we can start doing like unethical experiments again. You know, like, so there's reasons that hyperplasia hasn't been observed in humans, and it's just that it would require like unethical and unfeasible experimental models to be able to like directly observe it. But there are like indirect lines of evidence that suggest that, hyperplasia probably occurs in humans. The first is just that like, if we're setting a baseline hypothesis here, you would probably expect it to occur. You know, I said I wasn't going to do my whole hyperplasia thing. I'm doing my whole hyperplasia thing. Whatever. Like I've already started. It's fine. But yeah, so, you know, a lot of muscle physiology is pretty highly conserved between species. Like biology figured out how muscles do their thing, and muscles kind of do their thing in similar ways across different species. Not identical. Like the way our muscles work isn't identical to the way that like mice muscles or bird muscles work, but like muscle physiology generalizes between species relatively well most of the time. And in every like animal experimental model where people have attempted to observe hyperplasia, they've done it. So there's studies in birds, there's studies in rodents, there's studies in cats, there's studies in rabbits, and not just extreme stretching interventions that cause just huge amounts of overall growth. Like the avian stretch studies, we're seeing absurd amounts of total growth. So maybe it makes sense that hyperplasia occurs. But like in some of the research in like rodents and cats, we're like in instances where overall total increases in muscle size were like 15-20%, they still observed hyperplasia occurring. So it doesn't require extreme growth. It's not only observed after like stretching based stimuli. So in like some of the rodent studies and like the cat study, it was kind of like a pretty normal resistance training intervention. You know, they weren't putting them on like starting strength, but you know, just standard eccentric, concentric muscle actions in ways that like resemble how people would train, not stretching muscles for like weeks and months on end. So it's observed in multiple species. It's observed with like pretty normal resistance training type interventions. And so just as a baseline assumption, you know, I kind of think that you should assume that it occurs in humans unless there's like pretty strong evidence against it, because like why wouldn't that generalize? But yeah, that's like super indirect. Then in terms of like more directly relevant stuff, there's been research on cadavers looking at number of muscle fibers like side to side in the body. So specifically, your non-dominant leg in general, like the tibialis anterior of it over the course of your life probably gets a little more work than the tibialis anterior of your dominant leg. Because anytime you're doing something with your dominant leg, you're planting on your non-dominant leg, and your tibialis anterior is like a important kind of like postural control muscle to like stabilize the ankle when you're planting on one leg. And so, we're not even talking about intensive resistance training, because some people do tibialis anterior training. There's some people that argue that folks should do more. I don't have an opinion there. I don't care. But most people aren't going to the gym being like, dude, I need to get a jacked tibialis anterior. So yeah, it's a muscle that the stress it's exposed to throughout life is like just kind of normal stuff. Not even like dedicated training interventions for it. But yeah, in cadaver studies, they find that there are more muscle fibers on the in people's non-dominant tibialis anterior than their dominant side, which would be maybe consistent with just the slight increase in demands over a lifespan causing some hyperplasia. It is possible that it's not a causal thing, and just something about how our biology is arranged just knows that this leg's going to be the non-dominant one, and so it just needs more muscle fibers, and let's take care of that in utero or like very early childhood, such that no hyperplasia actually has to occur. That is possible, given that we're not actually observing changes over time. It's just, hey, how many fibers do we see in one leg versus the other after someone actually dies? You can't draw like a direct causal inference there, but it gives a pretty strong suggestion. Another bit of indirect evidence comes from a 1982 or 84. I don't have the paper in front of me, whatever. But a study from the 80s by McLaughlin and colleagues, where they compared the muscle fiber size of untrained versus like pretty high level strength athletes, I believe, either strength athletes or strength and physique athletes. They looked at like total bicep size, bicep fiber size, and bicep strength in untrained versus like pretty elite strength and physique athletes. And they found that obviously and pretty intuitively, the untrained folks had fibers that were way, way smaller than the elite athletes that do a lot of lifting. But then after like a 6-month training intervention, the average fiber size wasn't all that different between the people who have now been training for 6 months and the people who've been training for way, way longer and are overall way more muscular and way, way stronger still. Which, there are like multiple inferences one could draw from that. It could just be that people who are predisposed to being high level strength and or physique athletes are just born with more muscle fibers than other people, which is likely true. Like, I find that pretty plausible. Or it potentially suggests that folks who train hard for a long time might experience some hyperplasia, which helps them continue to grow. I personally find that quite plausible. The other inference one would draw is that the people who had been doing bicep curls, I think like twice a week for 6 months, since their fibers were now as large as people who are already like elite level strength and physique athletes, that would suggest that you're at your limit now. Your biceps aren't going to grow anymore. Like, your fibers are already as big as these people who are probably very close to their muscular limits. So guess what? Doing bicep curls twice a week for 6 months, that's it. Like, that's about as much as you're going to grow. I find that very implausible. So yeah, I don't know. I really think hyperplasia occurs in humans. Like, I can't say that there's like a direct RCT that proves it, but if I'm a betting man, I'd say there's like a 90% chance. Like, I'd take I would take pretty long odds on the proposition that that hyperplasia occurs in humans. So yeah, it has never been directly observed, but don't conflate absence of evidence with evidence of absence. Yeah, there's a difference between saying it hasn't been observed and it doesn't happen, and I'm like pretty confident it happens, but that's something for hopefully people to observe in the future. Like I really don't know what an experimental model to like validate that would look like. Potentially, you could do something where like, and this is also never going to happen, but I'm just trying to think of like something that wouldn't necessarily be a violation of like the Declaration of Helsinki and just normal research ethics that would actually allow you to do this. I think that maybe you could do some stuff with like amputees where if someone is getting an amputation and they have never engaged in resistance training before, and the muscles on the arm or leg that are going to be amputated are in good enough shape that you can actually remove them, take a cross section, count fiber number, and then they're willing to agree to do intensive resistance training, basically until their death. But like, maybe just due to like the atrophy and like maybe decrease in fiber numbers due to progressive denervation with advanced age, you wouldn't actually end up studying the folks unless maybe they died within the next like 5 or 10 years or something. But then if they do die in relatively close proximity to when their amputation occurred, but with enough time intervening that they had actually been able to get in several like pretty hard years of resistance training with their remaining limb, then they agree to give their body to science. And then on their contralateral limb, you can remove the muscles that they have trained, count fiber number there. Theoretically, that might be an experimental model that one could use to make inferences about hyperplasia in humans. But that's never going to happen. So until then, it's not going to be conclusively proven, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I really think it does. And that's it with hyperplasia. I'm going to shut up about it now.
Damn. First of all, Myron, the knowledge. Second of all, it is interesting to see just how different your take is, because back when I was a young first-year sports science undergraduate, and that was years after I first came across Strong by Science. Just to give you an idea of, Strong by Science really lies at the center of everything, and it's been around longer than I have been around. But when I asked my lab tutor at the time, hey, does hyperplasia occur in humans? Because I'd briefly come across some of the stretch studies in animals and was like, wow, imagine if humans could like grow new fibers, and that was really the key to getting more jacked, I asked him by email, and initially I got like a 2-line response saying, no, it doesn't happen, goodbye. And then, like a week later, unsolicited, he replied again and being like, yeah, no, actually I realized I was a bit brief, it probably doesn't happen. And so now, from that to Mr. Knuckles himself telling me, hey, it probably does happen in humans as well, but we just don't have the studies right now to be able to ascertain with any high degree of confidence that it does. So yeah, at the very least, what we can say from the SOLA study I mentioned earlier is that true stretch-mediated hypertrophy, in its sort of purest form, in the most internally valid and controlled setting and experimental design, does seem to occur independently of active contraction. So even if a muscle is inactive, or even unable to contract in the case of a denervated muscle, it can still experience stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So that's a noteworthy implication of these findings, because it does inform what might or might not be happening with humans performing resistance training and just with stretching interventions overall. Now, importantly, this wasn't the only study. The reason I like to mention this study in the context of stretch-mediated hypertrophy is because I do think it serves as a good starting place, and it kind of illustrates what the general study design looks like in these kind of studies, and also to point out that, hey, it doesn't really need to be active contraction based. You can still experience stretch-mediated hypertrophy even in the absence of any active contraction by the muscle. But then there are more studies out there essentially finding similar findings. Specifically, we have a recent meta-analysis by Warneke and colleagues, who I think is a recently crowned doctor in sports science after finishing his PhD on the effects of stretching. I could be wrong, but I think he has been a student in Germany somewhere for the past few years looking at stretching.
Now?
We crowned doctors, it's Europe, different place.
Robes,
Are you judging?
swords.
Yeah, I was gonna say in Finland, don't they get swords?
We get
That
swords
is pretty
as well.
sick.
You get swords too?
No. We
They
don't
just
get
made
it.
it up.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we get funny-looking
I was about
hats.
to say,
That's about it.
What the hell?
Which we
Yeah.
don't keep. We have to return. We rent some hats.
That's annoying. Anyway,
No swords, just rented hats. Very disappointing.
no crowns either. That's a bummer.
Anyways, this meta-analysis by Warneke and colleagues, as far as I'm aware, Konstantin Warneke has been looking at a lot of stretch-related stuff in humans and animals. And one of his studies was a meta-analysis on the effects of stretching interventions in animals on hypertrophy, hyperplasia, and a variety of other stuff. In this meta-analysis, across around a dozen studies, they found these stretching interventions in animals led to very notable hypertrophy. To give you some context of how large the effect size is, we're talking about a Cohen's d of about 8.5. Now, in the context of, I think Cohen gave these recommendations for how to interpret effect sizes initially, not even as a blanket recommendation. In fact, he recommended that people individualize the thresholds they used by which to classify effect sizes as small, medium, large, etc. But when he first came up with effect sizes and published on them, he recommended that small effect sizes were considered between 0.2 and 0.5, moderate between 0.5 and 0.8, and above 0.8 would be considered large. In this case, we're talking about an effect size for hypertrophy of 8.5, so comfortably an order of magnitude larger than what would be considered large in most studies looking at different phenomena. So we're talking about a very, very substantial hypertrophy. Similarly, another thing that was examined in this meta-analysis was the impact of stretching interventions on fiber length. And once again, they observed a very notable increase in fiber length of an effect size of about 7.8. And finally, as we just mentioned, hyperplasia to a fair extent, they also looked at the impact of stretching interventions in fewer studies, in about 5 studies, I think, on the number of muscle fibers. And once again, they did observe a notable amount of hyperplasia with an effect size of about 4.6. And so when you're talking about stretch-mediated hypertrophy in how it was first conceptualized, there's a few things that kind of stand out. First, it can occur even when a muscle isn't actively contracting or motor units aren't necessarily being recruited, right? Because it can occur even in denervated muscle. And secondly, we observe dramatic, consistent hypertrophy with effect sizes being quite a lot larger than what we observe in humans. So this should give you an idea of what effect size we typically see in humans performing resistance training interventions, aka, for example, training in the gym, on average across a pretty large data set that was actually put together by James Steele in a meta-analysis on variance in sports science. We observe an effect size on average of about 0.34. And that's from humans lifting weights. And as we'll come to later, lifting weights is likely, well, we can say with pretty high confidence that lifting weights does induce more hypertrophy than stretching in humans, it looks like, at least for most interventions we've tested. And so we're talking about a pretty big disparity between how much hypertrophy we see in these stretching interventions in animals versus how much hypertrophy we typically observe with lifting or even stretching, as we'll come to in a moment, in humans. And the final thing we observe with stretching interventions in animals is very large increases in fiber length and also in number. Now, as we mentioned, as we transition into more of the human side of things, we don't really have any data on the effects of stretching interventions on fiber number because you have to take out a muscle or sacrifice the human, which generally frowned upon in today's society. So essentially, that is the origin of the term stretch-mediated hypertrophy and the adaptations that we observe when stretching interventions are being imposed upon animal models. So whenever someone claims that lengthened partials are causing stretch-mediated hypertrophy, I think there's kind of two things they could be saying. One is just a very naive, well-meaning thing to say, which is that, oh, I heard that longer muscle length training causes more hypertrophy, so it's stretch-mediated. They're wrong in the scientific sense, but their mind is in the right place, essentially. But then, if they're claiming that stretch-mediated hypertrophy in the scientific sense, in the way that it was first conceptualized and originated in the animal data, is what is occurring with lengthened partials, you have to go through a lot of these considerations that I don't think many people are going through. Specifically, how do these results actually generalize to humans performing resistance training? And so the first thing I want to do is to kind of talk about how muscle even grows. Now, Greg just went through quite a bit of detail on whether or not hyperplasia occurs in humans, and the TLDR there, I think, is it probably does, but we currently just don't have a good way of assessing to what extent it does, and to really have an experimental model in place to establish causality there, even as regards what forms of training might cause more hyperplasia in humans. And so we're essentially left with, how does muscle grow, specifically as far as how individual muscle fibers grow. So muscle can certainly grow in size visually and what have you by the addition of new muscle fibers through hyperplasia, as we just mentioned, but we don't have any data there. But muscle can also grow by each myofibril, or muscle fiber, increasing in size individually. Although this is going to be a bit difficult to explain verbally, but I will do my best. If you're interested in more visual explanations on the topic, I would highly recommend you go check out the full article on Strong by Science that'll likely be out at the time of this recording. But I think one relatively straightforward way of visualizing how individual muscle fibers can grow is to visualize them as cylinders and to think of them essentially just as a geometric shape, right? So a muscle fiber can grow essentially either in series or in parallel. A muscle fiber growing in series, you can conceptualize it as the cylinder increasing in length, essentially. Whereas a muscle fiber growing in parallel, you can conceptualize as the radius of the cylinder increasing. So essentially it becoming thicker or it becoming longer. Now, specifically how that growth is likely to occur, based on a lot of our understanding of muscle physiology at this point, is through addition of sarcomeres either in parallel or in series. So each muscle fiber can be broken down even further, as far as the scale of things go, into sarcomeres. And a muscle fiber is essentially just a string of sarcomeres strung together, making up the whole muscle fiber. And ultimately, the sarcomere is made up of a variety of filaments, specifically titin, actin, and myosin, that enable your muscle to contract in the first place and enable you to be able to move around, contract your muscles, and do all that stuff. So the sarcomere is kind of the smallest functional unit making up the muscle fiber. And a muscle fiber is just kind of a string of sarcomeres being strung together. And so when you're growing an individual muscle fiber being made up of sarcomeres, you can either grow it by adding sarcomeres next to each other, or in that string of sarcomeres in line or in series, essentially. And going back to the cylinder thing, that would essentially just correspond to increasing the radius of the cylinder or the muscle in the case of parallel hypertrophy, or increasing its length in the case of in-series hypertrophy. To give you some even more confusing terminology that we'll probably be using for the rest of the podcast, just because that's how things are typically referred to in the research, growing a muscle fiber in series is typically referred to as longitudinal hypertrophy, as it's growing it on its longitudinal axis, so increasing its length. Longitudinal length kind of makes sense. And growing a muscle fiber in parallel is typically referred to as radial hypertrophy, which makes sense going back to the cylinder example of increasing the radius of the cylinder causing radial hypertrophy. So just kind of a quick aside on how muscle fibers are typically thought to grow. And these broad concepts were illustrated in a recent review paper by Jorgensen and colleagues, which essentially defined longitudinal hypertrophy and radial hypertrophy as the following. Longitudinal hypertrophy refers to the increase in muscle fiber length. So again, going back to the meta-analysis by Warnke and colleagues, they directly assessed this increase in muscle fiber from stretching interventions and found quite a substantial increase in muscle fiber. This type of hypertrophy occurs through the addition of sarcomeres in series, and it involves the muscle fibers becoming longer, which can happen generally as a response to specific types of training or mechanical loading that emphasize stretching and lengthening of the muscle, and specifically, as we'll come to later, potentially might be preferentially caused in humans by eccentric contractions as opposed to concentric contractions. So different styles of training can influence what kind of hypertrophy is occurring, right? Because both radial hypertrophy and longitudinal hypertrophy are fundamentally hypertrophy. And the way that we measure hypertrophy in practice, whether that's via beam mode ultrasounding, MRI, or most other methods in assessing muscle thickness, cross-sectional area, or muscle volume, will be impacted by increases in both longitudinal hypertrophy and radial hypertrophy. And to come back to radial hypertrophy, that involves the increase in the diameter of the muscle fibers. So again, just going back to the whole cylinder analogy, we would be talking about an increase in the radius or diameter of the muscle fiber, or essentially that cylinder becoming thicker as opposed to longer. So that's essentially just a quick primer on how hypertrophy is thought to occur in humans. Hyperplasia probably plays a role, and as far as the increase of individual muscle fibers goes, it probably comes down mostly to longitudinal and radial hypertrophy. Importantly, as I mentioned, an increase in the length of a muscle fiber, or a fascicle of fibers, and to give some context to the listener, a fascicle of muscle fibers is essentially just a bundle of muscle fibers put together. It's kind of like when you accidentally cut open a cable you have and you realize that the cable is made up of individual smaller wires. You can kind of think of that whole cable as a muscle fascicle, because it's putting together or stringing together several muscle fibers into one bundle of muscle fibers that we call a fascicle.
It also has the same root and same etymology as fascism.
Is that true?
Yeah. Where fascism comes from is there was like this term, I think in Latin, from like Rome, for like a bound bundle of sticks. It was like a phyces or something. And the iconography of fascism, where it would be kind of like a bound bundle of sticks with like a spear in the middle, was about like the binding together of the nation and the Volk and whatnot. A fascicle is the same kind of like structure of like bound together muscle fibers. Like it looks similar to that bundle of sticks when you look at it through a microscope. So they have like the same root and etymology. I'm pretty sure. I'll verify that while you continue talking. But I mean, I heard that somewhere, and I'm pretty sure that's true. So
it's verified.
Citation. It's verified just because of how in depth it was. Like either we're in the middle of either dreaming or a psychotic break, or you're just correct. And I suspect it's the second option. It's the latter.
I checked. Well, just to add something to this episode, I have checked. This has been PAC verified. As a Greek, I'm also going to use my Latin card because Greek, Latin, same thing. But, verified. And you got the origin word correct. I'm not sure if you pronounce it right, but it's fasces. Fasces. Crazy.
I mean, that's dangerously close to feces is all I could think about when you're pronouncing that, to be honest. But hey, back to fascicles, right? Fascicles, bundles of muscle fibers strung together. And specifically, just for the listeners' education, I guess, when we're assessing fiber length in humans, in living humans, using ultrasound typically, I'm actually not aware of any other method of assessing fascicle length. So when we're ultrasounding humans, we specifically measure fascicle length because visualizing individual muscle fibers using B-mode ultrasound is actually quite difficult, whereas fascicles are a bit more visible, and thus we can measure fascicle length, and that is often thought to represent the length of individual fibers pretty well, because ultimately fascicles should have a similar orientation as muscle fibers and should generally correspond pretty closely to the length of the muscle fibers as well. Although individual muscle fibers can have intrafascicular terminations, which is a big word to say that they don't necessarily span the whole fascicle length, to my knowledge. I could be wrong, hey, Greg, if you have something to add there.
No, I mean, that's true. But also the resting length of the sarcomeres can change such that fiber length can change with fascicle length, but it might not even necessarily denote a change in increase in sarcomeres in series, which, A lot of people assume that a change in fiber length implies a change in sarcomeres in series. Sometimes it does, not always.
Yeah. On that note, do you want to briefly touch on the one study we have on sarcomere length in humans by Pinchero and colleagues?
Is it necessary for this episode?
I mean, I guess it's just worth mentioning that we have one study on whether or not an increase in fascicle length stems from an increase in the number of sarcomeres in series in humans, or whether it's simply an increase in the individual length of each sarcomere. And because we only have one study, there's not much clarity there. But the one study we do have suggests that it may not even be, when we observe an increase in fascicle length, that we're adding more sarcomeres in series. It could just be each individual sarcomere becoming longer. That's what the only study we have in humans by Pinchero and colleagues seem to suggest. So I'm trying to keep things simple here, just because we're explaining physiology.
Well, and if people want to hear more about that, I'm like 95% sure we talked about that study in more detail in the episode you were a guest on a few months ago. So if people want to hear more about that study, you can check out that episode.
For sure. With that primer on how hypertrophy is thought to occur out of the way, I guess the next big topic we need to investigate is how do stretching interventions impact hypertrophy in humans? Because ultimately, if we're often talking about how lengthened training causes more stretch-mediated hypertrophy than shortened training, we need to figure out, do we even see this concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy in humans? At the very least, in the closest thing we have to animals being stretched out, which is human stretching interventions. Up front, there's a few things I want to say about how the literature from animals compares to the literature in humans. For one, the rate of adaptations in animals and humans tends to be different, and so you typically will observe a larger magnitude of change in animals than humans, all else being equal, and so that will explain why in humans we observe much smaller effect sizes in terms of how much hypertrophy do stretching interventions cause, and so forth. Another thing, though, is that typically in humans, you're not really able to have them do 24-hour per day stretching interventions. Again, going back to that whole pesky ethics thing where when you do a study, you need to pass it by an ethics board. And they often have scruples that we might not necessarily have about essentially having participants undergo intense pain through stretching for 24 hours a day for weeks on end. And so oftentimes in stretching studies, we're talking about protocols that are much shorter in duration on a per day basis than they are in animal studies. So for example, one of the more extreme studies in humans was a study by Wernicke and colleagues where they had participants stretch out their calves for 1 hour per day. So in terms of duration, we are talking about much smaller durations of exposure to stretching than we typically do in animals. So that's one difference. The other difference is, as I mentioned, the load being used for stretching interventions in animals is typically quite large, and it's usually a factor of body weight. So it's often like 10 or 20% of body weight, or 100 grams or 200 grams. For example, in the case of the study by Solo and colleagues, that is a substantial amount of weight being applied to stretch out the muscle as compared to most human interventions. By contrast, in most human studies on stretching, intensity is set as a pain rating on a visual analog scale. And so essentially, in all likelihood, we're talking about much lower intensity stretching in humans than in animals. So with those kind of caveats out of the way, I want to briefly discuss how humans tend to respond to stretching interventions. Fortunately for us, we don't have to delve into each study. We can look at a couple of review papers on the topic that were published in the last few years. First was a narrative review by Wernicke and colleagues, where, just to give you a quick lay of the land and not dwell for too long on this study, there were 10 studies on stretching in humans looking at hypertrophy. Of those 10 studies, 4 found no significant improvements in muscle size. Now, we've gone at length before as to why significance is not everything, but it's just to give you a lay of the land of, okay, compared to lifting weights, how much hypertrophy might we expect? To give you some more accurate estimates of the effect sizes we see in terms of hypertrophy and so forth from stretching in humans, there's another meta-analysis by, well, in this case, Wernicke conducted a narrative review, but as far as getting us a quantitative estimate of how large the effect is, we do have a meta-analysis by Panidi and colleagues from a few years ago as well. And they looked at all of the stretching interventions in humans. And essentially, I'll summarize their findings when it comes to muscle size, fascicle length, as I just mentioned, as a proxy for fiber length, and potentially for longitudinal hypertrophy, and also fascicle angle, which is thought to be a proxy for radial hypertrophy. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's already a fair bit of opacity or a lack of clarity when it comes to, okay, if we observe an increase in fascicle length, that is then thought to represent an increase in fiber length, which is in turn thought to represent an increase in the number of sarcomeres in series. Generally, whenever you're talking about this research, there are quite a few assumptions baked into the proxy measurements for different things that make any conclusions relatively tentative. So when, for example, I'm mentioning that fascicle length is representative potentially of longitudinal hypertrophy predominantly, and that increases in pennation angle, or essentially the angle at which the fascicles are orientated within a muscle relative to like an axis, that is representative of radial hypertrophy. When I'm saying those things, take them with a slight grain of salt, because there are a lot of assumptions baked into this stuff to the point that while we can look for overall trends and make tentative conclusions about what's going on and whether we're observing longitudinal hypertrophy or radial hypertrophy, there's a good chance things aren't as clear-cut as we would like them to be, as often tends to be the case with muscle physiology. Anything you want to add there, Greg?
No.
Wow. That was succinct. I thought for sure you would have something to disagree with, because I was like, okay, I'm talking about something relatively complex here. There's certainly something I must have messed up. Cool. Okay, so to summarize the findings by Panidi and colleagues into 3 sections. First, we'll talk about muscle size. First, they observed relatively small to non-existent changes in hypertrophy depending on the exact studies they looked at. So they performed a few subgroup analyses to look at how did hypertrophy or fascicle length adaptations or fascicle angle adaptations change as we looked at, for example, stretching interventions with higher intensities. So presumably with higher tension being imposed upon the muscle or a greater muscle length or what have you. And likewise with the duration of the stretching intervention. So for example, talking about interventions lasting more than 1.5 hours of stretching per week versus under an hour and a half of stretching a week. And so when you simply looked at durations of stretching below 1.5 hours or above 1.5 hours, we actually observed relatively similar hypertrophy. But when you specifically looked at higher versus lower intensity stretching interventions, you did go from about essentially a negative effect size for hypertrophy or a negligible effect size on hypertrophy, or essentially no increase in muscle size when you looked at studies that had lower intensity stretching interventions, to a small but potentially meaningful improvement in muscle size when stretching interventions were conducted with a higher intensity. So just to give you some context, when stretching was performed at lower intensity, the effect size was minus 0.11, suggesting that we didn't observe much additional hypertrophy, whereas when stretching was performed with higher intensities, the effect size was 0.27, which would be classified as a small effect size. Again, to give you some context with resistance training, aka lifting weights, the average effect size across quite a few studies that we put together in a meta-analysis by Steele and colleagues, or that Steele and colleagues put together, I wasn't involved with this paper, the effect size for lifting, for hypertrophy, is about 0.34. So we're talking about potentially meaningful changes in muscle size, and hypertrophy does seem to occur from stretching, but they do seem to be smaller than those you see from lifting weights. So if you're thinking, oh, stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it's this new big thing. I must now go and stretch all day to get jacked and get on stage next year and demolish everyone as a bodybuilder. Probably not the wisest decision. Lifting weights does still seem to be more efficacious at increasing muscle size compared to stretching interventions. Then when it comes to fascicle, hit it.
I will say, this is another experiment that's never going to happen. But like, I would love to see the avian stretch studies repeated on humans. the way that like our posture is different. Like we walk upright instead of being like slightly leaned forward. And there's a reason that all of the studies used the anterior latissimus muscle. Like that's the muscle that is just under stretch when you hang weights from a bird's wings. So I guess really the only muscle you could do it in for humans would be the traps. But yeah, dude, I would love to see a study where they just hang 50-pound weights off of people's wrists for like 6 months and see, do their traps get fucking enormous? Because who knows? I am open to the possibility that if you ran back like the Sola or the Antonio or just like any of the protocols used in the avian stretch research in humans, I'm open to the possibility that we might see some absolutely wild growth. But in terms of like normal stretching interventions and even abnormal stretching interventions, like the Wernicke calf stretch studies where you have your calf in a foot stretching orthosis on a 8 out of 10 on the pain scale for an hour a day. That's a lot of stretching. You're not going to do that by accident. So yeah, I mean, even with pretty intense stretching interventions, you're right. We don't see crazy amounts of growth. But I would like to see if crazy amounts of growth are possible if someone wants to volunteer to be our little baby bird and hang really heavy weights from their wrists for like 6 months to see if your traps get huge. Who knows? It might be cool. But yeah, you're right. For the most part, you don't see quite as much growth with stretch only interventions as resistance training interventions. And I think either all or most of the studies observing hypertrophy after stretch only interventions to this point have used untrained individuals. So, especially if you have some years of training under your belt, I think it's possible that doing some like long duration, intense stretching might yield a little growth. But yeah, it's probably not going to be the thing that really takes you to the next level and makes a huge, huge difference.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think there has been one study by Wernicke and colleagues that compared calf stretching for an hour a day, if I'm not mistaken, to resistance training and specifically calf raises. So kind of assessing whether at least like a reasonable stretching protocol is comparable to a reasonable stretching training protocol. And if I'm not mistaken, they didn't observe substantial differences in hypertrophy between stretching for an hour a day for 6 weeks versus doing just 5 sets 3 days a week. So 5 sets of calf training. So, for context, 5 sets of calf training might take you 10 minutes total, 3 times a week. So we're talking about half an hour of total time spent training. Whereas with stretching for an hour a day, we're talking about 7 hours spent stretching per week. So just as far as time commitment goes for the two groups to observe similar hypertrophy, I don't know. I think we would need to go quite deep into the stretching game, all pun intended, to observe a lot of hypertrophy, and at least anything that we would not get from just lifting weights.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. I agree. That's why I said I want to see someone hang 50-pound weights from their wrists for 6 months.
Why don't you do it?
That's...
Helms did the cow thing.
Wernicke thing for a while at least, I think.
Yeah. I know he did a little case study on himself. I'm not going to do the hang things from my wrist because it would get in the way. I wouldn't be able to type. I have a little desk job. 50 pounds of weights hanging from your wrist. They'd be propped way up. I'd be
if you want it bad enough, you'll be able to do it, and every day as you get stronger and stronger, you'll be able to type more and more, and that paycheck isn't going to keep coming unless you get stronger. So really, it's the most intense form of progressive overload there is.
Yeah, and like to be as direct as possible. Like I don't want it bad enough. I never said that I did want it bad enough. No, I have never in my life been accused of wanting it bad enough. I want the knowledge that can be gleaned from someone else wanting it bad enough. That's the thing.
But what's the point of the knowledge if we're not getting jacked in the process? Is what I'm saying. We gotta be our own test subjects. N of 1, bro. N1, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I do I do that with little experiments that I do on Bad Enough. But yeah, yeah, I don't want to be the test subject for that, but I want someone else to be.
That is entirely
Don't you-
fair enough.
Don't you want to get stronger by science?
It's true.
Yeah, I guess
String
I don't
theory
know.
was a much cooler name, at least much less amenable to being called out.
Yeah, getting stronger by science would be nice, but also, maintaining my strength and
By
just
science.
generally getting in better shape as I near my mid-30s, and I'm looking ahead towards the horizon to the great beyond and trying to push it out as far as possible. Do I necessarily need to maximize strength for that? Maybe not.
Probably not.
I've been pretty strong, and I'm happy to look at what I was lifting in my 20s and be like, yeah, it's pretty good. And I could be a little less strong by science and still be pretty strong, and it's fine.
Since you mentioned looking to the great beyond and we're on topic of stretching, one completely tangential question I have is, are you aware of much, if any, research looking at flexibility and longevity or overall health? So, because I'm thinking stretching, I'm thinking flexibility, and you mentioned the great beyond. Are you aware of any research? Because, I've kind of looked around and haven't really found all that much.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's one of those things where most of what people would try to use to draw inferences would be sort of like associations where you do see decreases in flexibility as people get older, which is in part probably due to decreases in activity levels. Being active helps maintain how well your body moves. That's fairly intuitive. And you also get some joint structure changes potentially downstream of inflammation. You could get some thickening of joint capsules, which could reduce range of motion independent of muscle extensibility. And you also get some glycation type cross linkages between muscle fibers and fascia, which reduces extensibility to some extent. And those are things that we tend to see with aging. I do think that people who do quite a bit of flexibility training do tend to maintain flexibility better into older age. But yeah, there are plenty of scary associations you can find where as flexibility decreases, a lot of scary bad things increase. But it's is that because flexibility is decreasing, or is that because both of these things are just jointly associated with the aging process, and I tend to think the latter. Oh man, this isn't something I've looked into for a long time, but if memory serves, one of the ways that flexibility training and interventions haven't panned out is people were thinking / hoping that flexibility stretching interventions might help reduce fall risk by kind of giving people longer ranges of motion that they could operate through, and therefore not fall because they kind of get off balance because they put their lower body in a position where they don't really have the flexibility for it. And if memory serves, that by and large hasn't panned out because people tend to fall because they're getting weak. And so it's if you have a longer range of motion but you're still very weak and can't control it, probably still going to fall. Kind of strength type interventions seem more productive for that. I do think that there's some stuff on movement practices that tend to be associated with increases in flexibility being beneficial for some of that stuff. I do think that there's some kind of optimistic evidence for yoga and Pilates specifically helping maintain function and independence into older age. And you do tend to see increases in flexibility with that, but are the functional improvements due to the flexibility or due to more kind of the movement practice and maybe increasing, proprioception, and even some strength benefits. Just, it's body weight, but these people tend to get quite weak. So who knows? Who knows? I do think, like you tend to see a decrease in flexibility with age. So if you want to maintain your flexibility, probably not a bad idea to do some stretching as you start getting older. But in terms of will that necessarily improve like health and longevity outcomes, I'm skeptical, but I also don't think it's a bad thing, just continuing to be bendier as you get older. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think that's a solid take. And I to agree with your point, I don't think I've ever seen an RCT on stretching not many at least, stretching interventions as a standalone modality and looking at whether or not that improves a lot of markers of health. So yeah, it seems like it's something that we have notably less research on compared to something like aerobic training or strength training or what have you.
There's some stuff on blood pressure. You have a acute hemostatic response to stretching, which I also don't think that a ton of people are pursuing that because it's like pretty short-lived. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, stretching used to be like very hot back in the day. I feel like it's one of those things where like I'm just barely enough older than you guys that I kind of came up in the generation where like people were very high on stretching. And then I want to say the study that everyone cites that kind of like started turning the tides against stretching. The first one that showed that like intense static stretching before an attempt at either max force or max power output reduced force and or power output. I want to say that study was published in like 2004. And just like I started, like the thing that people fight about on the internet comes and goes. Like it changes all the time. And I remember I started like reading more about like research and strength and conditioning and all of that stuff in probably, how old am I? It was probably like somewhere around 2003, 2004 ish. And I started getting more into the research side of things in maybe like 07 or so, like 06, 07. And that was kind of like the period immediately post, it seems like attitudes starting to shift about stretching, where like pre that time, people were so fucking stoked about stretching. Like they were all about that life, which seems so weird, like thinking back on it. But like 90s and like early 2000s, it's like, dude, you gotta stretch. It's gonna prevent injury. It's gonna improve performance. It's gonna do like all of this stuff. Stretching is the tits. It is the best. And then one study is published showing, it might acutely decrease force output a little bit. And then things just turned on a dime in the span of just like a couple years. And now you have people saying like, no, stretching will it's the worst. It's going to make you so much weaker and like less athletic, and it's horrible. And like, yeah, I remember in that era when people were like fighting and relationships were being ruined on the internet about something related to science and training and whatnot. It was people like losing their shit about stretching. Is it good? Is it bad? And yeah, that's way in the past now. But yeah. When I was coming up, there were still a lot of people who were like very, very stoked about stretching and thought that like everyone should do it, and it was like super great. But I think by the time you guys would have been coming into it, that was a little bit in the rear view, and people had kind of more of a neutral to anti view of stretching. So yeah, how things change.
I mean, it's interesting because obviously, I guess in the past, at the time, was stretch-mediated hypertrophy as hot of a topic as it is now as well?
Let's see. Back then the big thing was just like training through a full range of motion. And that was, I think, pretty uncontroversial. You had, I think by that point, the, what is it? Bloomquist? When was Bloomquist published?
2014, I suspect.
I was about to say 2014 as well.
Wow.
Let's bet, Greg.
I'm trying to think. I feel like there was at least one full range of motion study that had been published back then.
Pinto, I think. That's 2012. 2012 is sound. I'm pretty sure that's the first hypertrophy one.
Damn. Yeah, I don't know.
Recent.
I think I guess back then people were just saying train through a full range of motion and they had no research to cite for it. But no one was talking stretch mediated hypertrophy. But folks did generally say like, oh yeah, you should train through a full range of motion. It'll cause more growth. And yeah, I guess maybe they didn't have much to lean on until Bloomquist. I didn't realize it was that late. I thought it was like 2004.
No,
wow.
Bloomquist is relatively recent as well.
Dang.
Hey.
Okay.
Were the claims, like, because nowadays sometimes I see the claim that full range of motion is inherently less injurious or what have you. Were the claims like that around the time as well?
So like squats in particular, people were very leery of. There was in like the early to mid aughts, there was a lot of like deep squats, kill your knees type of deal. That was a very common thing you would come across. There was a oh man. I'm blanking on all of the names and papers from that era. There was a review paper looking at like
We got you.
and do what?
We got you. We recently did a mini deep dive into the whole squats are bad for your knees era and the original papers and then what followed after that. Give us a second.
It was Hartman, 2013. That was the one
Hartman.
that really.
That wasn't
that was the
hypertrophy,
one
but
that
it was squatting, yeah.
Yeah. That was the one. So pre Hartman 2013, there was a lot of debate of like, oh, will deep squats like destroy your knees and whatnot. And I do think that things started really, really shifting around that topic when that review was published, showing like, oh yeah, forces on the knees do increase as knee joint angle increases, but we also know the stress tolerances of all of the ligaments and tendons around the knees. And yeah, forces increase, but they're still way, way low, like way, way below the loading capacities of those tissues. So it's fine. But yeah, like in general, people tended to promote training through a full range of motion for most things. And it was just squats. They're like, deep squats are scary, but like, you should touch the bar to your chest on bench.
Yeah.
Let the weight go all the way down when you're doing bicep curls, stuff like that. There was a contingent of bodybuilders that were like anti touching the bar to your chest. Like, flare your elbows all the way and only go down to like 90-degree elbow angle. Anything beyond that will destroy your shoulders. Like there was some of that. So it was kind of like my memory of like the zeitgeist at the time was that in general, full range of motion was preferable, but there were like a handful of movements, with squat and bench being like the two most notable, where people were pretty where people were scared about going through a full range of motion due to like shoulder and knee concerns.
Damn. Yeah, no, I remember the strange double think around squats definitely being dangerous with full range of motion. but the same rationales around squats being dangerous weren't also being applied to other exercises quite as much. But yeah, squatting deep has always been, now it's glamorized, and it used to be absolutely vilified for sort of overall joint integrity or health or other buzzwords.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It is weird, like, to think back about how I don't know, like things that we just take for granted now in terms of like research interpretation that were relatively foreign to people at the time. Like a good example of this is like these days, if all you have to support some sort of statement or supposition is just like, there's an EMG study, people will be like, that's weak sauce. Like, we don't know if that's like predictive of hypertrophy over time. But like, dude, not even like, well, I was going to say not even that long ago. I guess this is pretty long ago now. But I would say like pre-2016, plenty of people were making like pretty strong inferences about EMG being like very, very predictive of hypertrophy. Like you would see it in the literature all the time. Like that's why there were so many EMG studies, like with absolutely no evidence to confirm it. Folks were just like, oh yeah, this is measuring muscle activation, which it's not really. And that is going to be like directly reflective of the training response. And so, yeah, we need to do a lot of research on this, and folks writing about it would make strong inferences from that. And these days we know more. Shout outs to Andrew Vygotsky. He was the person that I think put this on a lot of kind of industry people's radar, even though I'm sure folks like Anoka and DeLuca and whatnot had been tearing their hair out if they were even aware of like sports science research. But yeah. So it's similar with kind of the like deep squatting thing, because people would point to research back then. They'd be like, yeah, like as you squat deeper, like peak ACL forces keep going up. Peak forces on the patellar tendon, they keep going up. Like we see these forces on soft tissues go up as people get below get beyond like a 90-degree knee angle in the squat. And I do think like post Hartman, that kind of like set the paradigm that when people are reading that research, they're like, okay, well, these forces are going up, but what are the tolerances of these tissues? And if you're not seeing forces particularly close to the tolerances of the tissues, who cares? Like, it's fine. But before then, it's just like numbers go up, and when numbers get bigger, that's scary, Yeah, I don't know. In many ways, a lot of knowledge has accumulated, I think. Like even amongst people, like, man, you go back and you read research from like 2010, there are just like a lot of wild claims that people would make in discussion sections. Like even a lot of the researchers did not have like a strong theoretical understanding of the sorts of evidence required to make inferences. There was a lot of correlation necessarily implies causation type language that you'd come across all the time. And yeah, I don't know. I do think that in terms of just kind of like basic statistical and like research interpretation stuff, people are quite a bit smarter about that than they were a decade ago.
Yeah, it's crazy how many absurd claims can be made in the literature and somewhat get unnoticed or not G-checked, because in many discussion sections you see that there's speculation with like expressed not very cautiously, but still there's the odd this may be true because of this, then a citation, but then if you look at the citation you're like, is this even supporting the speculative claim? And welcome to research, baby.
Yeah, this is probably not a rabbit hole to go down fully, but it is. I don't know. One of the things that I'm like pretty sympathetic to is like whatever. Okay, yeah, I'm just gonna do this. That's fine.
Let's do it.
One of the things that like I think about a lot, and one of the things that frustrates me, is if someone asks me like, hey, I want to know how to find good sources of information about a particular topic, what should I look for? Like, I really struggle to come up with rules and like heuristics that wouldn't, I don't know, that would like be fucking useful, I guess. 'Cause like, I don't know, there are a lot of people and places that one would think would have like sufficient expertise and be good, reliable sources of information that end up very much not being good sources of information. And one of the things that I'm like really sympathetic to is when folks try to read some research and like dive into the literature and they come across claims in papers by the researchers doing the study who should, one would think, be experts on the topic that they're researching that are just wrong or making claims that go like way out over their skis. And it's one of those things where like unless the person reading that also has like the requisite level of expertise to see through that, I don't understand. Like I can't see why someone wouldn't just kind of take their word for it. You know what I mean? And like a good object lesson in this, I think is, do you remember the old Corey paper that people will cite to show that like a drug-free person can't achieve a fat-free mass index of above 25? You know, that old gym. Like there are, so just for people listening, essentially they had a sample of like 74 subjects that they recruited from some gyms in Boston, if memory serves, and they got their body composition and they calculated their fat-free mass index and not even raw fat-free mass index, which is just fat-free mass divided by height in meters squared. It's like BMI, but just fat-free mass instead of weight, like on the in the numerator position there. But yeah, like they applied a like quote unquote correction for height. Like the raw FFMI values, even in their sample, had some people above 25, but yeah, after they did like this correction, they didn't find any like the highest they observed with the corrected FFMI metric was like 24.8. And they like pretty, I can't remember if they directly stated or just like very strongly implied that like, yeah, without drugs, like you're not going to see people getting a fat-free mass index over 25. And like like proposing that as like not a complete like unimpeachable limit, but like a functional limit. Like, you know, you're not 100% sure someone's on gear if their FFMI is over 25, but like you can be about 95% sure. Like that's what you would take away from the paper. And like, I don't know, if you know about this stuff reasonably well, like if you understand things about like sampling and inferences, then if I told you, hey, we're going to take a sample of 74 people and whatever the like peak characteristic of whatever we're observing we find in that sample of 74 people, even if they're like pre-selected to be pretty high like exemplars of a particular ability, if I said, yeah, and the highest value we observe, that's as good as it gets. In most areas, people would be like, nah, like that's wild. You know, like if you went to like a random track and field meet and you're like, hey, let's let's just observe 74 people run 100 meters, and the fastest someone runs, like that is the limit. Humans can't run faster than that. Unless your sample happened to include Usain Bolt, you didn't find a limit, like you can only make inferences but so strong from like that type of sample. And it's not even like they went to like a bodybuilding show and sampled like 74 bodybuilders. They note in the paper that like there were a handful of subjects that were successful like strength or physique athletes, but the only criteria was they had to be over 18 and have at least 6 months of training experience. And I got to tell you, you're not going to find like a hard limit in that type of sample. But like, yeah, if you know more about research and you read the paper, you're like, yeah, no, like these authors are getting pretty far out over their skis. But if you're someone who doesn't know quite as much about like research interpretation and you read that study, I can understand why you'd come away with it thinking that like a 25 FFMI is like the so-called natty limit. And that was like a thing that just a lot of people just believed for like a decade, if not longer. And if you'd say like, oh no, like people were getting, like the researchers here were being a little over eager with the inferences they're trying to draw. Just in terms of like external markers of expertise, they have PhDs and they're the ones that actually did the research. And so if someone is making like a very valid critique of it, but they don't have like the same credentials, or even if they have an advanced degree, but it's like they're not doing work in that field, any sort of like external marker of expertise would suggest that like, oh no, like the people doing the research would have like a stronger claim to expertise. And if you yourself are not an expert, you just go with the interpretation the researchers have of their own findings. And so I don't know, like that and sort of like related instances really kind of like black pill me a little bit on the idea of just like anyone being able to like reliably find credible sources and understand things relatively well in any field where they're not like able, capable, and willing to invest a ton of time to develop like intense expertise of their own. Like I don't know. Like I don't want to put anyone on blast, like name any names, but like there are a lot of people who like in the fitness industry who purport to be like quote unquote science-based or evidence-based, that like the stuff they put out just sucks. And or at least like a lot of it does. And like I can't think of any like reliable external markers that I would use to like discriminate those folks from people who I think are doing good work and putting out good content. Like I think it's I don't know. I think it's basically an impossible problem. And I don't remember. Oh, yeah. Talking about squats kill your knees. Like a lot of people came away with that idea because a lot of researchers were saying things along those lines. And it's just like, well, they were wrong, but like, I'm not sure how like non-experts would have not been wrong there. You know what I mean? Unless they pulled a Hartman and they just had enough expertise to like critically appraise it for themselves. And yeah, I don't know. I think by and large, a lot of people are just kind of held hostage by the limitations of researchers themselves, where if the stuff at the top, if they get things wrong and draw incorrect inferences, most people just aren't going to be able to see through that, and they just get shit wrong. And I am very sympathetic to it because I understand why. Like, how are you going to see through that, you know?
Yeah, it's hard as well because obviously on any topic, you always want to have some sort of consensus. And I think if you're overconfident about what a certain research design can tell you about a topic, you can very hastily form a consensus, like in the case of the Hartman stuff. Ooh, we observe high forces at the knee when you go deeper. That is probably maybe a bad thing. And so just because directionally it is thought to be potentially a bad thing the consensus is temporarily in favor of it being a bad thing, but then that's without observing the fact that, hey, this research design, it's not necessarily going to tell you about whether or not squats are bad for your knees. Like it is not well equipped to do so. And I think it's just like the haste with which some people like to come to conclusions about a topic based on an insufficient number of studies, or more specifically in this case, an insufficiently direct way of answering the question. Cool.
Yeah. A lot of acute proxies that have never been validated to be predictive of longitudinal outcomes. People just assuming that they're predictive of longitudinal outcomes. Very fun stuff. Very fun stuff.
And it's often the proxy for a proxy, which is then thought to roughly mirror a physiological variable that is then roughly thought to influence hypertrophy.
Yeah. It rocks, dude. It's so cool. Okay, we should get back to stretch-mediated hypertrophy.
All right. So just to get back to the Panini et al. Meta-analysis I mentioned earlier, essentially relatively modest hypertrophy was observed that was improved upon not so much by the duration of stretching, but specifically with higher intensities of stretching. And generally, the magnitude of hypertrophy being observed was lower than what you would see with resistance training studies. Now, when it comes to fascicle length and fascicle angle, which are thought to roughly represent longitudinal hypertrophy and radial hypertrophy respectively, so an increase in the length of that cylindrical muscle shape or an increase in the radius or thickness of that cylindrical muscle shape. When it comes to fascicle length, the increases only became meaningful once the stretching intervention lasted at least an hour and a half a week. So when stretching interventions lasted under an hour and a half a week, the change in fascicle length was actually slightly negative, but altogether negligible at minus 0.06. So a negative trivial effect size. Whereas with interventions lasting for at least an hour and a half of stretching a week, the increase in fascicle length, or longitudinal hypertrophy, was then increased to 0.29, or what we'd call a small effect size. Likewise, increasing the intensity of stretching, so comparing lower intensity stretching to higher intensity stretching, also seemed to increase fascicle length changes, with lower intensity stretching causing a change in fascicle length of minus 0.04, and higher intensity stretching causing a change of 0.28, so again, a small increase. But specifically for fascicle length and what we think is longitudinal hypertrophy, it seems like both the duration of the stretching being quite high and the intensity of the stretching being quite high are important factors in making sure that we actually observe any meaningful change in fascicle length. And finally, for fascicle angle, which is thought to represent increases in radial hypertrophy, these changes were actually more meaningful with lower durations of stretching. So when duration of stretching was under an hour and a half of stretching a week, we observed a small effect size in favor of stretching of 0.31 versus essentially no change when stretching interventions lasted over an hour and a half a week. And likewise, fascicle angle changes or pennation angle changes didn't really differ whether intensity of stretching was high or low. So it seems like, essentially, with muscle size changes, intensity of stretching is important. With fascicle length changes or longitudinal hypertrophy, both intensity and duration seem to be important, such that higher intensity stretching and longer duration stretching both increase changes in fascicle length. And finally, for pennation angle, lower durations of stretching, if anything, seemed more favorable. But with a relatively limited number of studies, I think with some of these findings, it's difficult to tell, is there really a dose-response relationship here where you need to be spending less time stretching if you want to induce radial hypertrophy, or more time stretching if you want to induce more fascicle length increases. But broadly speaking, it is just worth noting that many of these stretching interventions, we're talking about minutes to, like, in some cases, up to an hour of stretching per day. That duration of exposure is relatively important, and it's something we'll come back to. So yeah, those are the rough takeaways from the Panini et al. Meta-analysis that I want to give. One thing that Greg actually brought up, so he might be best positioned to touch on it, unless you want me to cover this, is just how these results relate to potentially the influence of lengthened resistance training on hypertrophy or stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So is that something you want to cover, Greg? Do you want me to cover it?
Nah, I got it. I got it. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay, cool. So this is like a very pedantic point, but I think that it's fairly relevant. Words mean things, and when you're talking about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, you are hoping that you're observing an effect that is mediated by stretch, and mediation has like a technical statistical definition where if one thing, like if something is mediating an effect, that means that it is something that influences the outcome of interest that is being influenced by whatever stimulus you're dealing with or whatever characteristic you're interested in, such that the thing, in terms of if you're dealing with like direct mediation, that means that thing A causes thing B causes thing C, and like thing A only causes thing C because of thing B. If you're dealing with partial mediation, which is what we'd be dealing with here, the stimulus directly affects the outcome, and the stimulus directly affects the mediator, and the mediator directly affects the outcome, such that the outcome is the result of both the stimulus and the thing that is mediating the stimulus. So that might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, but oh man, I'm trying to think of an example on the spot. Oh yeah, so here's like a classic example of mediation that comes up a lot, and I'm trying to think of like a non-fitness related example here, just something that maybe people have encountered before, to kind of give them a decent mental frame for how one might think about mediated effects. So an example is like racial disparities in health outcomes. Like that's a pretty classic example of mediation where like Black Americans, for instance, tend to have worse health outcomes than white Americans. And so people watching here on YouTube, independent variable here would be race. And then the effect would be health outcomes on the right side of the graph. But, you know, like race has an effect, but also another thing that we tend to see is like socioeconomic status is correlated with both race and health outcomes. So like there's a greater number of Black Americans in poverty than white Americans. And so the impact of race on health outcomes is partially mediated by socioeconomic status, such that race explains, like race impacts socioeconomic status, race is related to health outcomes, socioeconomic status is related to health outcomes. So you have like a partial mediation model where, you know, thing A directly influences thing C, thing A directly influences B, and B also directly influences C. So like that's what you're dealing with when you're talking about mediation. Does that make sense? Like, do you think I explained that reasonably well?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. So yeah, if we're dealing with stretch-mediated hypertrophy, that would mean that stretch is mediating this effect to some extent. So, you know, the way that you would explain that with a partial mediation model is you have training at long muscle lengths. Training at long muscle lengths directly, like the kind of tension stimulus induced by the training, will directly cause some hypertrophy outcome. It will also cause some stretch. So in that partial mediation model, that the mediator there would be stretch. So training at longer muscle lengths causes stretch, and then stretch, like the stretch induced by training at longer muscle lengths, also has a causal impact on the hypertrophy outcomes. So you can kind of like, if it is a stretch mediated effect, you should be able to kind of like diagram things thusly. And so like the SOLA study that Milo talked about at the top of the episode is an example of stretch mediated hypertrophy, and they reported enough data that you could sketch out that full mediation model. So the weighted stretching intervention, like the load hanging off of the wings, when the wings were still innervated, like to some extent, the birds like that still had innervated wings would be contracting against that load to some extent, but also the stretch itself is causing a hypertrophic stimulus, and they reported the effect, like the muscle growth with and without denervation. So you can see the impact of the mediating effect of stretch there, such that of like the 180% total increase in muscle weight observed, you see that 140% of that is mediated by the stretch, and the other 40% is like the contraction against the load that is hanging from the wings. So like you can sketch out that partial mediation model where the total effect is like 180% increase in growth. 40% of that is direct from A to C, like the tension with contraction and whatnot. That's where like 40% of it comes from. But then the weights hanging also causes a stretch stimulus, and the stretch stimulus, even without active innervation and contraction, explains the other 140%. So of that total 180% increase in muscle mass, like 140% of that 180% is mediated by the stretch itself. And so you can sketch that out. And so if you're dealing with a mediated effect, that's what you should tend to see. And so research in this area should kind of like conform to that model. And I can talk about the Pedrosa study, or you can, Milo. I'm
yeah,
good either way.
Hit it.
Okay. So just to illustrate how we are probably not dealing with a stretch mediated effect here, there was a study by Pedrosa that I think was the first long length partial study, if not, well, the first that compared it to full range of motion training, I believe. Unless we count the Godo tricep study, which I don't, and we've talked about that before, and that's fine. Whatever. It's one of like the classic. Well, I say classic now. It's from like 2021. Feels like a long time ago. But one of the long muscle length partial training studies, and so it'll be in the show notes. But basically, over like 8 to 12 weeks, something like that, they had people train their quads through either 30 to 65 degrees of knee flexion. So that was short muscle length partials versus 65 to 100 degrees of knee flexion. So that was long muscle length partials. And they looked at both the vastus lateralis and rectus femoris, but just kind of like pooling both of those two muscles together. About twice as much growth was observed when training at the longer muscle lengths than the shorter muscle lengths. So if that is mediated by stretch, like if that is a stretch mediated effect, then what you would then kind of take away, since the relative training intensity was similar, like they were training with the same relative loads based on like the range of motion they were going through, same proximity to failure, all of that. like the other variables were equated. It was just the range of motion being trained through, and therefore like theoretically the quote unquote stretch that they were being exposed to that differed between groups. That would mean that the direct effect of kind of the tension stimulus of the resistance training would be the direct effect in that mediation model. And then the difference between longer muscle length training and shorter muscle length training would be induced by the stretch that was caused by training at longer muscle lengths, such that, about in explaining the total growth observed in the longer length training group, about half of it would be explained by the direct effect of just the tension of the training stimulus, and about half of it would be explained by the quote unquote stretch stimulus induced by training at longer muscle lengths, such that like the direct effect should be the same between the shorter and longer muscle length group, with the stretch from training at longer muscle lengths mediating the like additional growth observed when training at longer muscle lengths. Like if it is a stretch mediated effect, that is what should be happening. And there's just no way. So in essence, first of all, dear listener, as you're listening, just bend your knee to 90 degrees real quick, and bend it a little past 90 degrees. Bend it to 100 degrees, and just feel how much stretch do you feel in your quad right there. The answer will probably be none. Like none that you can actually feel. I think by kind of like technical definitions of stretching, like the sarcomeres being extended past their resting length, your muscle is technically in a stretch there, but it's a very weak stretch. Like it's not an intense stretch. And the total amount of time spent at these stretched long muscle lengths would have been somewhere around 2 minutes per week. Like given the rep cadences used in this study and the total volume of training performed, it would have been like 130-ish seconds of time spent in that stretched position. So if the effect is being mediated by stretch, if you did the training through short muscle lengths, which caused about half as much growth as training at longer muscle lengths, and then independently spent about another 2 minutes per week with your knees flexed to 90 to 100 degrees to then equate the stretch stimulus, like you're doing that independently instead of having it mediated through the training at longer muscle lengths, that should cause about as much growth as doing the training through longer muscle lengths that cause twice as much growth as training at shorter muscle lengths. If you hear that and you think, no, that's insane. There's no way that would happen. There's no way that if I do short muscle length partials and then just hold my knees in like 90 to 100 degrees of flexion for 2 minutes per week, that will double my gains. If that sounds implausible to you, you and I are on the same page. That does sound incredibly implausible. But if this was an effect that was mediated by stretch, that is what you would expect to see. So I don't think we're dealing with an effect that is mediated by stretch in just like the purest kind of definitional sense of the term, for a couple of reasons. One, just kind of what would that be in nerd speak? A reductio ad absurdum. Like if this is true, this is what you'd expect to see. You're not seeing this shit, therefore it's probably not true. But also like just the like ranges of motion that people train through in most of these studies just wouldn't be causing much significant stretch in the first place. So referring to the Paniti meta-analysis, like you generally need to do fairly intense stretching for fairly long durations, like over an hour and a half per week, to reliably cause like considerable muscle growth with stretch-only interventions. And so for the impact of training at longer muscle lengths, for the additional muscle growth to be mediated by stretch, you would need to observe similarly, similar intensities of stretching and similar durations of stretching for that mediation to occur. And the duration definitely isn't there in the longer muscle length training research. You're, again, maybe spending like 2 minutes, maybe 5 minutes per week at slightly longer muscle lengths when you're actually doing these exercises. Like if you're even doing like high volume training for a particular muscle group, you're not spending an hour and a half like training your quads per week. If you're doing high volume quad training, you're resting a lot, like if you're doing a ton of quad training, maybe your quads are under load for like a total of 10 minutes per week. And that would still be a ton. I think. I don't know. I don't feel like doing the math. Anyway, they're not under load for an hour and a half per week. Like, absolutely not. So in these training interventions, there's not enough duration for that to independently cause a lot of hypertrophy. And in terms of stretching intensity, I mean, a pretty good number of the studies finding increased growth when training at long muscle lengths. Like the most popular muscle to study, I don't want to overstate this. There have been some more calf studies recently. Milo, you can fact check me on this. Still the most popular muscles to study are the quads, right?
Correct.
By far.
Yep.
Yeah. So when looking at long versus short muscle length partials, when looking at full range of motion versus short muscle length partials, like all of these lines of evidence, the quads are by far what's looked at most frequently. And there are a couple squat studies. So like full versus partial range of motion squats in Kubo, I think was like 140 versus like 90 degrees of knee flexion or something like that. But for the most part, the like long muscle length groups are going through up to about 90 to 100 degrees of knee flexion, like the Pedrosa study that I was talking about. And 90 to 100 degrees of knee flexion is not that much knee flexion. Again, you get in that position, you're not feeling much of a stretch. So the intensity of the stretch stimulus and the duration of the stretch stimulus are well below what we know to be necessary to cause an independent hypertrophic effect from the Paniti meta-analysis. And for these effects to be mediated by stretch, the stretching stimulus would need to be sufficient to explain the difference between the hypertrophy observed with long versus short muscle length training, and it's simply not. Most of the research finding more growth when training at long muscle lengths is not training at maximal muscle lengths. Like for the most part, it's like slightly longer ranges of motion than like a lot of the long muscle length training interventions are things that like even a lot of like gym purists would call partial range of motion training, like short length partials. Like one of the more striking studies in this area, I think, and I mean, one of the more ecologically valid as well, paper by McMahon, doing quad training where they use like a variety of exercises. I think it was like squats, lunges, maybe knee extensions as well, like of several different exercises. And one group was training through up to 90 degrees of knee flexion, and the other was training through up to like 50 degrees of knee flexion, something like that. And like squatting through 90 degrees of knee flexion, brother, that's a half squat. Like that is not a deep squat. And it observed like quite a bit more growth when doing the like long muscle length or like full range of motion training versus the other group doing partial range of motion training. But again, squatting through 90 degrees of knee flexion, like that's still partial range of motion. But that was still like sufficient to cause quite a bit more growth than only training through 40, 50 degrees of knee flexion. So you don't need to train through longer muscle lengths, like sufficiently long muscle lengths to even induce any significant stretch in order for training through longer muscle lengths to lead to more growth. Therefore, like in the strictest sense of the word, like it's not a stretch mediated effect. Like the effect is not mediated by stretch because we're not dealing with a stretch of any significant duration or intensity here. And you need very significant duration and intensity for stretch to cause much growth. And that's just not what we see in these interventions. Where training at longer muscle lengths is leading to more growth. Like it I don't know. The effect isn't stretch mediated. Like I don't see how it could be.
Yeah, the irony with that study specifically is, as you mentioned, even the longer muscle length group didn't train to that deep of a knee flexion or likely that long of a motor unit length or whatever, like muscle tendon unit length, because that's another rabbit hole, which is like muscle length doesn't uniformly change across a range of motion.
Oh yeah.
So like you might think that
especially under tension, like the more tension you're dealing with, like you're going, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but yeah, like going through 90 degrees of knee flexion not under load is probably causing a greater change in like actual fiber and or sarcomere length than going through 90 degrees of knee flexion under load, because when you tension the muscle, like more of the change in muscle tendon unit length is coming from extension of the tendon. Whereas when you're not under load, like tensions are pretty stiff, like they need quite a bit of tension put on them to extend. So yeah, like when you're not under load, like your actual muscles are stretching even less, doing actual like quad training through 90 degrees of knee flexion than just doing like a passive knee quote unquote stretch at 90 degrees of knee flexion, because your tendon is extending more. So like the fibers themselves don't have to extend as much. So yeah, like the stretch in a resistance training context of training through those muscle lengths is even less than the stretch experience when you just do it passively. We're not dealing with much stretch here at all. Like very little duration, very little intensity, still quite a bit more growth. Doesn't sound like mediation to me.
No, and it's especially ironic when you consider like everything you just said about stretch mediating hypertrophy, when the title of the paper, like Mahan, was adaptations to longer muscle length training are stretch mediated or something like that. Like literally the word stretch mediated or in the title of the paper, when the muscle length being trained through was likely like not sufficient to cause that much of a stretch. And it's a more ecologically valid study than most, but just
my rant about people very understandably and justifiably running with the interpretations of researchers, even if those interpretations are wrong, come in full circle. That wasn't even intentional. I had forgotten that the McMahon paper described it as a stretch mediated effect.
In the title.
Yeah, you're right. They did. And brother, that's not a stretch mediated effect. Absolutely not.
No, and then it gets even more confusing because just to finish off this this tangent, because like the studies we have on different muscle length training and looking at hypertrophy and seeing potentially greater hypertrophy from longer muscle length training, oftentimes they don't measure mechanisms. And when they do, for example, in the case of this McMahon study, they measure IGF-1 or like resting IGF-1 levels in the group that did longer muscle length training and the group that did short muscle length training. And so because we have, I think, 2 studies on the topic actually measuring mechanisms, like I think it's very intuitive for people to just assume it's stretch mediated because there's no other well-researched or evidenced mechanism that is like we can rely upon to be like, yep, this is what's happening. So I think sometimes people just default to thinking it's stretch mediated.
It's also how it's been communicated. Like there's if you YouTube stretch mediated hypertrophy, there's many videos saying things like try this lateral raise variant to stimulate stretch mediated hypertrophy. This is the key for more muscle, stretch mediated hypertrophy. And I think people just liked how that sounded because they're like, oh, the stretch matters, stretch mediated, yeah, whatever. Obviously, they haven't done the deep dive that you just heard. So it's like, oh, cool. Yeah, stretch seems to be good. Stretch mediated. We're going to roll with it. But like, that's how many people are thinking of like that without even understanding what the term means.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Cool. Okay, so with that out of the way and basically explaining why, although stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a thing, and we potentially observe more hypertrophy from lengthened training than less lengthened training, it is unlikely that the hypertrophy observed is truly stretch-mediated. It's just very unlikely based on the durations of exposure, causing a sufficiently large effect to explain away the difference in hypertrophy observed, essentially, based on the research we have on actual stretching interventions in humans and how small the magnitude of change tends to be, even with longer durations of stretching and higher intensities and what have you. And those are also being performed at the longest possible muscle length, as opposed to many of the lengthened partial interventions and lengthened studies in the literature not actually being at the longest possible muscle length, right? Like, I can think of like one study, maybe, where like the muscle length being trained through in one of the conditions is truly what I'd consider as lengthened as possible, and therefore comparable to what you'd see in stretching studies as far as pure muscle length is involved. So it is just very unlikely that we're dealing with stretch-mediated hypertrophy when it comes to lengthened training and seeing more hypertrophy from that versus more shortened training. So I guess just kind of wrap up some of the stretch-mediated hypertrophy discussion that we've had. It's important to discuss like what types of resistance training do we typically, what types of resistance training typically cause different changes in hypertrophy? So as I mentioned earlier, there, as we currently think, different types of hypertrophy, more so longitudinal hypertrophy and more so radial hypertrophy. And one of the common claims that I've heard made, and I think we have received one listener question on the topic, is that lengthened training causes stretch-mediated hypertrophy, and that the primary adaptation associated with stretch-mediated hypertrophy is simply an increase in fascicle length or longitudinal hypertrophy. And more specifically, that claim is sometimes made alongside the idea that you are for sure adding sarcomeres in series, and that is what's happening. So just to touch on the sarcomeres in series thing again, in humans we have one study and it didn't really show that. But as far as the claim that lengthened training causes stretch-mediated hypertrophy, and stretch-mediated hypertrophy is predominantly characterized by an increase in fiber length, which we would measure in humans through measurements of fascicle length, that is something that we wanted to look at. And specifically, it does seem like there are types of training within humans that cause greater increases in fascicle length than others. So when you look at the research comparing, for instance, concentric training and eccentric training to isometric training, so eccentric contractions where the muscle is producing force but is lengthening, concentric contractions of the muscle where the muscle is shortening, and isometric contractions, the muscle is producing force but is not changing in length. So you can kind of just think of it in more colloquial terms as the lifting phase of a movement being the concentric phase, the lowering phase being the eccentric phase, and if you pause at any point, that's an isometric phase because the muscle length isn't changing. You're holding a static position. And when you compare the studies that have compared these contraction modes and look at the sort of adaptations that happen architecturally, there are a few things that stand out. We did a quasi-systematic review, which is not a term I've ever heard used, but essentially I just tried to look at as many studies as I could find on concentric versus eccentric training versus isometric training versus even accentuating the eccentric via adding more weight to it and that sort of stuff. And there's a few consistent findings that seem to occur. One is that muscle growth does seem to occur from resistance training in the absence or alongside increases in fascicle length, which we think represent longitudinal hypertrophy, and also alongside or in the absence of changes in pennation angle, which we think might represent changes in radial hypertrophy. So you got to keep in mind that even when we're measuring things like fascicle length or pennation angle, which we think represent longitudinal hypertrophy and radial hypertrophy respectively, there is still some degree of measurement error involved. So even on the assumption that these things are tightly correlated physiologically with changes in longitudinal or radial hypertrophy, because there is some measurement error involved, the correlations between changes in fascicle length and pennation angle are actually still relatively low. So for example, a review paper by Emma and colleagues from 2013, 2015 or something looked at correlations between changes in fascicle length and pennation angle and changes in overall muscle size, and found significant correlations between those two variables and changes in muscle size, but those correlations were only about 0.3, so what we would deem weak. Some of that is going to be attributable to just difficulty in measuring fascicle length and pennation angle and having some measurement error, but to an extent it also implies that, hey, none of these variables is singularly responsible and can explain away the changes in muscle size we observe from training. Like, it's going to be a combination of both factors at the very least, and there's a good chance that other variables that we're not measuring could also explain some of the changes in muscle size as we measure it. And so another thing that is observed is that eccentric only training very consistently seems to cause greater increases in fascicle length than concentric only training. And that applied also when you were just adding more weight to the eccentric, what we call in the research accentuated eccentric loading. But specifically, it seemed like concentric only training, conversely, increases pennation angle more than eccentric only training. And so specifically when it comes to isolating the eccentric phase of a movement and the concentric phase of a movement, there is evidence to say that these different phases of the movement may cause hypertrophy in different architectural fashions. And so that might, if you think of it in a more holistic fashion, suggest that you probably do want to include both phases of the movement, both concentric muscle actions and eccentric muscle actions within your training to get at these different kinds of hypertrophy. It's not an open and shut case, but it does kind of suggest that. Specifically, if you just compare muscle hypertrophy as a gross outcome without differentiating between potentially radial hypertrophy or longitudinal hypertrophy, eccentric only training might have a slight edge over concentric only training when it comes to inducing hypertrophy. There's other variables that might contribute to differences in adaptation. For example, higher load, like conceptualized as percentage of your max training, might increase fascicle length adaptations even more, and that might explain why eccentric training generally increases fascicle length or fiber length more than concentric training. You're typically able to produce a bit more force eccentrically than concentrically, and so all else being equal, that might explain why fascicle length increases are greater eccentrically versus concentrically. Likewise, faster velocity eccentric contractions seem to cause greater increases in fascicle length as well, or longitudinal hypertrophy. So if ever you've seen athletes do Nordic curls for the sake of injury prevention, oftentimes, that is the sort of training that we would expect and that we, in fact, often use to study this idea that would cause increases in fascicle length, because we're talking about, most of the time, eccentric only contractions, because very few people are strong enough to do concentric Nordic curls with their hips extended. At least I'm not. I've been doing them for a while now, and it's not happening. So it's typically eccentric only. It involves very high forces because the moment arms make it quite a challenging movement. Most people can only get a few reps, so you're dealing with very high forces at the knee joint, and you're typically dealing with relatively fast eccentric contractions because most people can't control the eccentric on Nordic curls all that well either. So it's likely a movement that would cause a lot of adaptation in fascicle length. Greg, anything you wanted to add there?
No, I was considering whether I wanted to talk shit about Nordic curls, but I'm not going to.
Go for it. Hey, no, let's talk shit about
it. Please.
Yes.
I said I considered it and decided not to, and you need to respect my choices. And
I am very sorry. Yeah, that's cool. We'll avoid this tangent for now then. So at the very least, what this data tells us is that resistance training, one, as we already knew, grows muscle. But two, more importantly, different types of resistance training might preferentially cause a greater increase in fascicle length or longitudinal hypertrophy, or a greater increase in pennation angle / radial hypertrophy. Specifically, eccentric contractions being more so biased towards longitudinal hypertrophy, and concentric contractions being more so biased towards radial hypertrophy. The question is, though, that doesn't necessarily tell us much about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, because in pretty much every one of these studies, the range of motion being gone through was equated for, and therefore the muscle length being trained through was equated for. So while this body of evidence does tell us, hey, different forms of resistance training can also cause hypertrophy, can also cause changes in fascicle length and pennation angle, it doesn't tell us whether, we see consistently greater increases in fascicle length or pennation angle or whole muscle size from lengthened training versus shortened training. Importantly, even the assumption I mentioned earlier that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is characterized by an increase in fascicle length is on pretty shaky ground. If you go back to the results by Panidi and colleagues in humans performing stretching interventions, a few things. One, increases in pennation angle or fascicle angle are still notable, and specifically when stretching for less than an hour and a half a week, they did observe an effect size of 0.31 of an increase in pennation angle even from stretching. So it's not as though in humans, stretch-mediated hypertrophy is characterized by exclusively inducing increases in fascicle length. It seems like there's probably also going to be increases in pennation angle, even with what we would deem stretch-mediated hypertrophy in humans. So it's not as though fascicle length can explain everything. And two, the magnitude of increase in fascicle length only really occurs with, as Greg mentioned, relatively high durations of stretching at relatively high intensities. So there's kind of upfront a reason to expect that lengthened training and shortened training, there's not going to be a huge difference in, lengthened training isn't going to be causing more stretch-mediated hypertrophy than shortened training in all likelihood, the way we typically study it, because the duration of time being spent in lengthened positions isn't sufficient to really induce it. So we went ahead and looked at all of the studies that compare a more shortened form of training, whether that's an isometric hold or dynamic muscle action or anything else, to a more lengthened form of training, and trying to equate for the contraction type, as that can often be a confounding variable, like we just talked about. Eccentric actions tend to cause greater fascicle length, and concentric muscle actions tend to cause greater pennation angle increases. And so we looked at these studies. We found about, if I recall correctly, 9 studies. And to summarize the findings, training at lower muscle lengths does generally seem to increase fascicle length more than training at shorter muscle lengths. The effect seems to be quite consistent, with only, I think, a study or two not finding this effect when measuring fascicle length. And so this suggests that lengthened partials or more lengthened forms of training probably do result in notably greater longitudinal hypertrophy than shortened training. Training at lower muscle lengths, however, also generally increased pennation angle more than training at shorter muscle lengths. The effect there was a little bit less consistent, but it was still notable, and the effect size was a bit more modest than for fascicle length. But that suggests that not only would lengthened training cause more longitudinal hypertrophy, but also a bit more radial hypertrophy than more shortened training. So it's not as though, even if you assume that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is just an increase in fascicle length, that is all that is happening, because we do still observe consistently greater increases in pennation angle or radial hypertrophy from lengthened training versus shortened training. And more broadly speaking, across these studies that we included, it did seem like muscle growth was typically larger with lengthened training than with shortened training. So yeah, those are kind of the takeaways from the lengthened versus shortened resistance training research as far as fascicle length, pennation angle, etc. goes. Anything that you two wanted to add regarding the resistance training research and how it typically influences architectural adaptations?
I did just want to very briefly remark on something, actually briefly this time, and that is that, I don't know, for some reason, and like this fully confuses me. I don't understand it. When I see people discuss adaptations in fascicle length and pennation angle, it's generally, like, I pretty frequently see it presented as like a binary thing. Like, this style of training increases fascicle length. This style of training increases pennation angle. With the implication that, like, oh, if you're increasing pennation angle, you're not increasing fascicle length, and vice versa, or that like a style of training that increases fascicle length more must inherently be worse at increasing pennation angle, with the implication being that, like, oh, you're just increasing muscle length, but the actual fibers themselves aren't growing by doing this. Which is, I don't know. I've always found that quite confusing, because, like, if you just zoom out and look at resistance training as a whole, both happen. Like when you take an untrained person and have them lift weights, you generally see an increase in both fascicle length and pennation angle over time, which suggests to me that they aren't decoupled adaptations and that they can occur simultaneously. And if something generally promotes more muscle growth, it shouldn't be that wild for it to be possible for it to maybe be better for increasing both fascicle length and pennation angle. But I don't know. It is just confusing to me that it seems to be frequently presented as a binary thing, when I don't think it is.
Yeah, it's. I think it's just reductionism and I think it reminds me of many of the things that you learn about when you first get into sort of like strength conditioning textbooks or things that tend to be simplified for the practitioner, where I think that sometimes the information around, concentric training, that increases radial hypertrophy, eccentric training, that's all fascicle length. That information tends to get dumbed down quite a bit in my experience when it comes to communicating it to the practitioner who doesn't really need to know that, hey, these things tend to happen alongside each other, just to varying degrees depending on the exact training being performed.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. One other thing that I also just wanted to note, just about kind of like the correspondence between pennation angle and radial hypertrophy, because like I think you made this pretty clear earlier in the episode, but we're oftentimes dealing with like assumed associations upon associations. Like in the absence of biopsies, changes in pennation angle are often assumed to be reflective of or associated with changes in fiber cross-sectional area, and so you kind of assume that it's reflective of radial hypertrophy, which, you know, I don't think is like a terrible assumption. But even with like the eccentric versus concentric thing, let's see. I think I don't remember if you ended up citing this in your article on this topic or not. But like the handful of studies that have been done that have compared actual changes in fiber cross-sectional area with eccentric versus concentric training tend to suggest that like fiber cross-sectional area increases more with eccentric training than concentric training as well. So, you know, it's one of those things where it's like direct measures versus proxy measures, where maybe you do see in general slightly larger changes in pennation angle with concentric training than eccentric training. But that may not necessarily even imply that concentric training is better for radial hypertrophy, because like in the studies that have actually taken biopsies to see, hey, what's making the fibers bigger? Most of those studies suggest either no difference or slightly more growth with eccentric training. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to make that little note. Because yeah, I do think that I don't know. I think all of this stuff is interesting. But I also like the reason I bring that up is like in my experience, a lot of people find like muscle architectural changes outside of just thickness and cross-sectional area to be like somewhat confusing and unintuitive. It's just like, hey, my muscles are getting bigger, but like fascicle length, like what is that? Why is that important? Pennation angle, what is that? Why is that important? What is that reflective of? Radial hypertrophy, why? Like it's just the angle that is coming off of the tendon. Like, how's that? Like you need like a decent and like this isn't throwing shade, but you need like a decent and intuitive grasp of like geometry and trigonometry that you can just kind of like hold in your brain as you're like reading or listening to this stuff for it to like click and make intuitive sense. And like, I don't know, like that's just not a, like that doesn't come naturally to everyone. So I wanted to just kind of like make that note again that like, Yeah, we have this stuff on fascicle length. We have this stuff on pennation angle. It is probably somewhat reflective of and associated with different types of growth, increases in length, increases in cross-sectional area. But we are also dealing with like associations upon associations. And oftentimes the direct and indirect measures of these things don't always agree. And if you I don't know. Like the I oftentimes I think, especially in this case, like the most I think people think that you always need to like dig under the surface for things, and like I think oftentimes that's fun, and I don't think you like lose anything by doing so, but I do think it sometimes makes it a little bit easier to get lost in the sauce here. Where kind of like big picture, when people train at longer muscle lengths, they tend to grow more. And you can tie yourself up in knots trying to figure out like, oh, is that pennation angle? Is that fascicle length? Well, we see larger increases in fascicle length, but is that actually like longitudinal hypertrophy in terms of like increases in sarcomeres and series? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. The pennation angle, is that... Well, looking at some comparisons, maybe that's reflective of larger increases in fiber cross-sectional area. Maybe it's not. We don't have a bunch of studies like actually taking biopsies and directly assessing it. Like, as you get deeper and deeper, it's easier to tie yourself up in knots and get confused. But sort of like at all resolutions, it appears that training at longer muscle lengths tends to cause more growth overall, like pennation angle, fascicle length, thickness, cross-sectional area, everything. And if you're listening to this and you find yourself getting a little confused or overwhelmed by the pennation angle and fascicle length stuff, I just want to say it's fine. And if you don't fully get that part, it doesn't really matter because we're seeing more growth, and that's fine. I don't know. Yeah.
I think, yeah, I fully agree.
I hope that's reassuring to some folks.
I think it should be, and that's why I've always tried to like focus. Obviously, my PhD was on long muscle length stuff. One thing I've tried to focus on is to not convey too much of an impression of clarity around what the mechanisms are and what they mean for your training. Because ultimately, what you care about isn't exactly what the mechanism is. It's, will I grow more if I do this or do that? Right?
Yeah.
And the mechanisms might have implications for how we should operate with these practices, but until we have a decent grasp on the mechanisms, which we currently don't, I don't think we should modify our practices based on, is it radial hypertrophy? Is it longitudinal hypertrophy? Is it stretch-mediated hypertrophy? But in this case, we do have a fair amount of evidence pointing to the fact that it probably isn't stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So that kind of wraps up all of that. I think we've done a decent job of explaining stretch-mediated hypertrophy, why it likely isn't what's behind lengthened training, where the term first originated in the animal models that were often studied, and just kind of breaking down what the different kind of types of hypertrophy are and what modalities of resistance training might preferentially target them, but ultimately realizing that they often occur alongside each other. Is there anything else that you, Greg, or Pac wanted to add regarding this stuff, or do we want to move on to some Q&A?
I did want to... I did want to circle back on something that I made note of earlier in the episode. Like, the reason that I think that this is an important topic is that, it's good to know what is happening, but it's also, in a perfect world, we know why it is happening as well. Like you said, you try not to confuse people a lot with the mechanisms, and that's largely because it's still pretty hazy, and you don't want to overwhelm people. But it would be great if we knew precisely why more muscle growth occurred with long muscle length training. but we don't yet. Like there are still a lot of question marks there. It is almost as good, I think, to know what's not doing it, because there are like implications of stuff. You know, like if you observe something, you're going, like, it's natural to like make inferences about what to do based on like your assumed understanding of why something occurs. So in this case, if you see there's generally more muscle growth with longer muscle length training, and you hear the term stretch mediated hypertrophy, and you think this is an effect that is mediated by stretch, then there are downstream implications of that. Like, you would assume that, hey, if I can't feel a deep stretch in a muscle when I'm doing a particular exercise, stretch mediated hypertrophy is off the table. Like, I'm not feeling a stretch. Therefore, more hypertrophy can't occur at longer muscle lengths, like when training at longer muscle lengths. Or you might assume that, like, you know, you need to, I don't know, like one thing that I've seen from a few people is concern about trying to stimulate stretch mediated hypertrophy with their hamstring training, because they're trying to do like RDLs with a really deep stretch, but they're like, I can't, like, when I try to go that low, like, I'm either people like aggravating like high hamstrings strain injuries, or people who maybe have like kind of janky back, and when they get into really deep hip flexion, they get some spinal flexion as well, and they're like either dismay because they're like, stretch mediated hypertrophy of my hamstrings is like off the table because I can't go to these like really long muscle lengths, or they're like forcing themselves to train through quite a bit of pain because they think it's like super, super critical to do this thing that's like uncomfortable for them, but they think, hey, I'm dealing with a stretch mediated effect. It needs to be through the longest range of motion possible so I can get this like deep, intense stretch in this muscle. And if the effect isn't stretch mediated, which again, probably not, like there's I think almost no chance that at least most of this effect is stretch mediated. You don't need to worry about that. Like, just as a general heuristic, training through longer muscle lengths generally causes more growth, whether or not you feel a stretch in the target muscle. Again, you're not getting a stretch in your quads by going to 90 degrees of knee flexion. And that's what that is the experimental model that most of these studies use. So yeah, just training through the longest range of motion that is like safe and comfortable for you, it's fine. It's fine. Like, you don't need to go like out of your way or do something that feels like unsafe or dangerous to you in an effort to feel a deep stretch, because we're not dealing with stretch mediated effects. Like, that is, I think, like a pretty functional takeaway of this. Like, yeah, train through the longest, like, load and train through the longest range of motion that you safely and comfortably can. And if that doesn't coincide with a stretch, like a sensation of stretch, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not still good and beneficial. Like, the sensation of stretch and the benefits of training at long muscle lengths are two separate things. Like, they don't have to coincide with each other.
Nice. Yeah, this has turned into another lengthened partial episode, hasn't it?
No, not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair takeaway. And just to reiterate, as you mentioned, I think there's like one study on lengthened training where you can argue they were actually training at the longest possible muscle lengths. And yeah, they did see a benefit. But most of the studies that see a benefit really don't have you training at all that long of a muscle length. So just because you can only get to just past your knees on your RDL doesn't mean you're missing out on all of this stretch-mediated hypertrophy. You're likely still observing the benefit.
Which is the one you're thinking of? Was it the
Cassiano study? Yeah.
Honestly, I would probably throw Kubo in there as well. The squat study. I mean, the full range of motion group in that was 140 degrees of knee flexion. Like, that's pretty deep.
It's deep, but I still think it's not maximal. Whereas like 25 degrees of dorsiflexion, that is like a pretty deep calf stretch.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, I don't know. Just kind of, yeah, just going off of published norms, like full range of motion for the knees is generally defined as like 150. And for dorsiflexion, it's usually defined as like 30, 35 degrees. But yeah, I don't know. Those are the two that come to mind as like at least pretty close to like maximal range of motion. And in the Kubo study, it was comparing 140 versus 90 degrees of knee flexion, if memory serves.
Yep.
And there were differences in like glute and adductor hypertrophy in that study, if memory serves. But there weren't differences in quad growth in that study. Like, you know, you're training the quads at like way longer muscle lengths through 140 degrees of knee flexion, and it didn't seem to be like meaningfully different than 90 degrees of knee flexion. So
yeah, that's an interesting study.
I'm honestly, I don't know. I feel like this is another conversation for another day, but I am honestly like not all that convinced that you actually need to train through like I sort of think that the beneficial effects of training at longer muscle lengths do kind of like plateau past a certain point, such that like training at the longest possible muscle lengths may not be any like meaningfully different than training at like 10 degrees less of a joint angle than that.
Sure. I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable, and that goes against the whole stretch-mediated hypertrophy as well, like that being the relevant factor. Because if the end range of motion doesn't matter that much, then by definition, it's not as much of a stretch-mediated hypertrophy component.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not super confident in that. Like we need more research that is comparing like long versus very long instead of like kind of long versus very short, you know? Because most of it is like kind of long versus very short. But yeah, I mean,
that's the thing, right?
That is still something I think about.
When it comes to lengthened versus shortened training, we have a lot of evidence in the sort of like middle 80% or 70% of the muscle length spectrum. That's where pretty much all of the experimental designs we have fall on. But when it comes to those ends of the spectrum, both the very shortened and very lengthened end of the spectrum, that's where we have much less confidence about, do you actually need to maximize muscle length to see even more hypertrophy potentially? We just don't fully know. But we do have evidence that, hey, generally across like isometric studies, partials versus full range of motion, partials of different muscle lengths, and so forth, generally lengthened training tends to produce more hypertrophy. And that's kind of as confident as we can be regarding your implementation of the findings if we want to be quite conservative. So, yeah. Anything else you wanted to add regarding stretch-mediated hypertrophy that you can think of?
No.
Beautiful. Awesome. All right, let's segue into some Q&A.
Okay,
cool. I got a variety of questions here. Some of them from the Strong by Science Reddit. If you haven't already joined, check it out. You'll be able to ask questions for future episodes and get your questions answered. And likewise, some questions from the Strong by Science community Facebook group. So check both of those out. First, we have a question from user Rayden1990 on the Strong by Science subreddit. His question is, I understand that you've been doing a long-term experiment on yourself, I think referring to me, doing lengthened partials only. Please, could you comment on the results? What have you observed in terms of hypertrophy outcomes, but also are there any practical considerations you have identified? So I'll keep this relatively brief. I have been doing almost exclusively lengthened partials for the past year and a half now. So since January 2023. As far as the hypertrophy I've observed, I would say I have gained muscle at a rate that is commensurate with the fact that I've been training for 10 years now, which is to say very little muscle as a natty advanced lifter. But I'd say like I have gained some muscle, and so at the very least it's not killing my gains, to put it that way. And realistically, it would be very difficult for me to tell you that I'm observing more or less hypertrophy as a result of doing lengthened training, like compared to a similar time frame before, because there are so many confounders involved, like whether it's exercise selection, my biological age, my training age, my sleep, my stress, my work schedule. Like, a lot of things could play into it and potentially have a more meaningful impact on my hypertrophy than simply me doing lengthened partials now versus me doing full range of motion previously. But what I can say is that I have still made gains, and I'd say certain areas might have grown a little bit more. It's really hard to say, but I feel like maybe my back has grown a little bit. I don't really know. I couldn't tell you for sure. As far as my experience goes, something I have more confidence in telling you about, I would say it's relatively straightforward, but there's a few practical considerations. Depending on the movement you're performing, I would say there's different features or landmarks you can aim for to just standardize range of motion and be consistent week to week. So for most compound upper and lower body movements, I like knee and or elbow angle. So I typically end my lengthened partial reps at around a 90-degree joint angle. So on a squat, for example, I'll aim to end the rep around 90 degrees of knee flexion. Conversely, if I'm doing any sort of chest pressing, for example, I'll typically aim to end the rep when my elbows are at a 90-degree angle, and then come back down and get into that stretched position again. A lot of machine work, you can kind of figure out some sort of feature of the machine to pull to and end the rep there, or any sort of feature of the machine that you can use to standardize range of motion week to week. The final practical consideration I've identified with lengthened partials, there's kind of two actually. One is for certain lifters, and this is more so as a coach and as someone who's communicated the findings that, hey, lengthened training, and specifically lengthened partials, because that's mostly what we've looked at, seem to be good for hypertrophy. People tend to respond to that in a couple of ways. One is, oh, nice, I'm going to try lengthened partials. But the more common response is some degree of reluctance to just do partials. And I understand, because if you've been training with full range of motion for a while, it can be a bit daunting or frustrating to have to change your training around, and all of a sudden you don't know how much weight to use and so forth. And so one common way people have been implementing this stuff that I think is reasonable as well is doing some partials after full range of motion failure, or just doing some partials at the end of your set, extending the set essentially. I've previously called that a lengthened superset, where you essentially just do lengthened partials after your full range of motion set. And funnily enough, we actually have conducted a study on the topic that hasn't been published yet, up in Denmark, I think, with Stian Larsen leading the study. And basically in the calf raise, in a within participant design, we compared doing just full reps to, with the other leg, doing full reps, but then extending the set, doing partials until either a volitional failure, where people are like, yeah, this is too much pain and I can't keep going anymore, or until they couldn't get another lengthened partial or get out of peak plantar flexion anymore, so that most lengthened position, which obviously quite painful, as you can tell by Greg's face if you're watching this on YouTube. That's literally why, by the way, the pain, why midway through the study, even though we'd pre-registered the study as being like, we end the set when they can't even move out of that fully stretched position anymore. That's why halfway through the study, we had to amend the pre-registration to say volitional failure or that, because a lot of participants are like, yeah, this is not happening.
I was going to say, like, yeah, people watching on YouTube, the face I made, I like, that's how I do calf training. And I feel, at least, like I can just, like, the first like 5-10 degrees of the range of motion, I feel like I could just do that forever, and it would just be like more and more uncomfortable as I go, and like more and more blood flow is occluded. Like I mean, I push my training pretty hard, and like that is how I do calf training, and I don't feel like I've ever gotten like particularly close to volitional failure on that. Like, you know, the point at which I can no longer do full range of motion reps feels like it's 50 partials before I wouldn't be able to like move that partial at all. Like, that sounds barbaric. And,
yeah, it's rough.
I want to try it now.
Hey, and that is exactly what they did for 10 weeks in a within participant design. Obviously, a very shortened biased movement, in that like the hardest part of the calf raise is at the very top when your gastroc and soleus are most shortened. So take these results with some degree of caution with generalizing this to other movements and other muscle groups. But they did observe about 50% more hypertrophy with in Bayesian terms, because we used a Bayesian framework, strong evidence of doing lengthened supersets being superior to just doing full range of motion reps for hypertrophy in that exercise. So yeah, it seems like you would probably grow more muscle by doing partials after failure on a movement that is very short and biased compared to just doing full reps. So that might be an alternative way of applying the lengthened training research, is to say, all right, I'm just going to do some partials after failure. I still think lengthened partials is probably the best way to go about it, just because it's the way we've studied the most, and it kind of shifts the needle the most into the lengthened direction. But this might be an alternative. The final consideration is one I've forgotten now. So I'll pass it over to both Greg and Pac here. As far as I want to get your thoughts on how to implement lengthened training, if you've played around with it at all yourselves, and what your experience has been. Have you identified any practical considerations or more hypertrophy than previously?
Do you want a rocket pack? Or
Sure.
Do you want a rocket pack?
Yeah. So since obviously Milo and I both went to the same university, and I've known Milo since the beginning of his PhD, so I've gotten the behind the scenes sort of scoop on everything length and partial related and long muscle lengths and so on and so forth, including the transition of Milo's training from absolute full ROM to just half ROM. Me personally, I do incorporate partials in some of my training, but the main takeaway from the ROM research has been, if I don't feel like doing the lockout here, I'm probably going to be fine. Not a big deal. We'll skip it, without necessarily having an extremely meticulous approach to incorporating length and partials in my training. But from a muscle growth standpoint, I think I've made gains. Obviously, I've been lifting for like 12, 13 years or something by this stage. So difficult to say whether it's because of the length and partials or just time and effort. But yeah, they've been great for back training and for some arm training. And overall, it's just good to be like, okay, we're gonna now put the full stack on any stack loaded machine, do a few reps. Oh, I can only get partials. Well, that's fine. So I'm okay to use the full stack. Guys, I'm doing science here. Let me be. I'm not ego lifting the full stack. I'm doing science. So that's been also very cool. But yeah, overall, it's been fun. It makes training even more flexible, in my opinion, because there've been some cases where I've had some pain with my elbows and shoulder, and being able to specifically do length and partials with the placebo points of, oh, I'm not losing muscle here because I'm not locking out, or I'm not missing out on gains and potentially making slightly more gains. That's been great, because going low load and length and partial for some movements was a great way to work around those injuries. So yeah, that was me.
Yeah, for me, I don't know. It's hard to say whether it helped me experience more growth, because I've always just kind of done them, I guess. And so yeah, I mean, I've grown a lot throughout my entire training career, but I don't have kind of like a control period of time to explain it to. I will give another practical way that you could use them, although I don't know if this is necessarily the way you'd want to use them for growth, but whatever. My warm-up for lifting is essentially just weighted stretching in by doing long muscle length partials. So for instance, to warm up for bench press, what I typically do is either grab dumbbells and just, like as if I was doing dumbbell bench, and just let them sink down as far as I can, and then just gradually extend my elbows to feel like a deeper and deeper stretch in my chest, and kind of do little long muscle length presses from there. And once my pecs feel sufficiently loose, then slap some weights on the bar and let's go. Or I'll do hand elevated push-ups, just similar type of deal. For squats, I've always, well, not always, but I mean, for a long, long time, my warm up has just been breathing pause squats, where I put some weight on the bar, go down, take deep breaths, try to sink into the stretch as much as I can. Do that up to like 405 or so, and then stop doing that from there. But it's the same type of deal. Like I'll go down and at first just relax to kind of like sink into it, and then just do little like bounces at the bottom to stretch out further and get deeper into it, which is effectively long muscle length partials. And yeah, like most muscle groups, like that's just how I warm up. And it's been good. It helps things feel nice and loose and ready to move through a long functional range of motion for whatever training I'm about to do. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that's going to cause a ton of growth, but I do find that it does help me like comfortably kind of like unlock a longer range of motion to load and train through for some exercises than I would maybe have with just kind of like a more general warm up, I guess. So that's fun. And then yeah, I don't know, for like heavy compounds, I typically don't and haven't done many long muscle length partials. I don't know, like it's hard to say exactly why, but I mean, probably because I'm a power lifter, it just doesn't feel right, you know? Like once I can't lock a bench press rep out anymore, I'm done. Like that's the end of a set. But for accessories, I've just always done long muscle length partials. Like it just makes sense to me, I guess. And in the way you were describing with the calf study, I don't really like, so one of my first training partners was this like old guy at the YMCA. I have a bunch of stories about him, and not a ton of them would be safe for the podcast, and that's fine. He was a great guy. But he was like an old school bodybuilder. And so he was big on like, I don't think we ever talked about this explicitly, but I think he kind of came from like the Mike Mincer approach to things, where he wasn't just doing only one set, but I don't think I ever saw him do more than like 3 or 4 sets in a workout for a particular muscle group. But he would just start by going through a full range of motion, and then when he couldn't complete full reps anymore, he would basically just keep pumping on it until he just couldn't move either his body or whatever implement he was lifting, and that was the end of a set. And yeah, so like that's how I learned to lift, and that's how I tend to do most accessories. There was a period where I don't know, like I've experimented with a lot of stuff in my training career, and there were like periods where I was doing like extremely dedicated, like only like powerlifting stuff, where there used to be this, there was like an era where kind of like maximal velocity for everything was like the big thing. Like you want to train yourself to be more fast twitch, and like when you start feeling things slow down, stop the set, and you know you're not going to end up going particularly close to failure, but you just do like way more sets to compensate for it. And like I did that for a while, but for most of my training career, yeah, like go to failure, go past failure, and once my range of motion gets down to like 2 inches, it's like, okay, I'm sure that's enough, so let's rest up and do it again. And that's just how it feels right to me to do accessory stuff. Like I know I've mentioned this here and like on other podcasts before, but like, and I'm not trying to like, if you do this, I'm not saying anything bad about you. No one take this as an insult, but like, I cannot understand the headspace of like quantifying RPE for like bicep curls or like tricep extensions or flies or whatever. It's like, it's a single joint thing. It's one muscle group, or one muscle. Just do it. Just go until you can't go anymore. That's just it. It's just what feels right to me. You know, I kind of feel if you can keep moving the implement, just keep doing it.
Just do it.
Yeah. And I'm a sick fuck. Like I like the pain, the like intense burn you get when you go past failure. I'm like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. I think most accessory work is boring, and I think like the pain makes it like mentally stimulating enough that I'm like, okay, lock it in now. Like now the fun stuff is starting. Like I just squatted 600 pounds. Like that could theoretically kill me. And now I'm doing fucking knee extensions. Like, no, the first 90% of this set is boring. Like I need my legs to start telling me that they're going to kill me for how they feel. And like now I'm alive. So yeah, that I just think that's a fun way to do accessories, and that's mostly how I've always done it.
I mean, hey, there you go. You have the first study actually looking at that approach, so that's pretty cool. Obviously not published yet, so I can't share I can if anyone asks, but it is not currently publicly available, the manuscript of the full study. But yeah, that's pretty cool, and I think that approach has its merits in terms of certainly being more time efficient in all likelihood. Just like if there's any additional stimulus to be gained by going to and past failure, you're getting it. And so for any given set,
I'm not doing it for time efficiency. I mean, I'm still doing like 5 or 6 sets of those.
I mean, hey, there you go. You're just blasting away. The one final practical. Oh, sorry, go for it.
No, you got it.
The only
I was about to read the next question.
Oh, okay. You can read it in a second, actually. But the only practical consideration I want to give otherwise is consider the movements you do lengthened partials on relatively carefully. Because certain movements, I just wouldn't recommend doing them close to failure. Like, if you're barbell benching on your own with lengthened partials, I don't know I would recommend that. I think you're probably better off doing 4 range of motion reps and staying a bit more submaximal, obviously without spotter arms. Certain movements you probably can't safely fail a lengthened partial on that easily. Like, safely failing a squat out of squat stance, for example, just doing lengthened partials or what have you, might not be ideal. Same with a barbell bench press. Just consider the movement you're doing. The same with a leg press, depending on the leg press setup you have. And so there are typically alternatives that you can use to better effect, or at least safer effect. For example, substituting the free weight barbell squat with the Smith machine squat, so that you can essentially just re-rack the weight at any point if there is a need to do so. But yeah, so those are really the only practical considerations I would give that I've noticed. So yeah, next question if you'd like, Greg.
Yeah, so George Zureb from the Facebook community says, last set on select exercises, I perform all reps as lengthened partials. When I do so, I increase the weight to make up for the shorter range of motion. Is this a good way to incorporate lengthened partials?
Yeah, so by and large, I think that's a totally fine approach to use. You're essentially just performing one set as lengthened partials, and the rest is 4 range of motion. The one thing I would point out regarding the weight increase is that you may or may not actually be able to do that for all movements. Like, certain movements may actually be harder with lengthened partials, all else being equal. So for example, I think that most squatting and bench press variations are a little bit harder as lengthened partials, provided you're doing more than like 3 to 5 reps. Like, for a single rep, you might actually find you're able to lift more than lengthened partial on a squat or bench press. But for most hypertrophy-based work, because you're essentially cutting out that mini rest you get near the lockout or the relatively easier part of the movement, I typically find I'm actually able to use less weight. And so generally, I would just think about the movement you're doing. Like, if you're doing a movement that is hardest in the shortened position, then yeah, like for example, most back training, pull downs, rows, pull-ups, dumbbell pullovers, what have you. In those cases, yeah, you will likely be able to use more weight. But for movements that are typically hardest in the lengthened position, like most bench pressing is hardest in the lengthened to mid-range, most squatting is hardest in the lengthened to mid-range. For those movements, you likely will be using less weight if anything, so just consider that. And I would say, to be honest, within a few weeks of doing lengthened partials as part of your training, you should have a pretty good grasp of how heavy should I be going on this movement versus that one. But when first approaching it, just consider where the movement is hardest. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that approach. What do you guys think?
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah,
I
same.
think it just depends on the movement.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. All right. I'll
Okay.
hit the final question, and that's from user Boyer Stuff on the Strong by Science subreddit, who asks, I frequently read the argument that the benefits of stretch-mediated hypertrophy are finite, that training with a focus on it will hit a wall after 6 months or something. So the additional gains from it will stop once you reach the quote-unquote stretch potential, and after that, no more additional benefit. Often, the reasoning being that the fibers reach their maximal length and can't be stretched more by this mechanism. That would be why advanced, big lifters train in a shortened position, pump style, and that's more beneficial for them. To me, that whole reasoning seemed kind of dubious, but I can't really argue it myself. So my question is, does stretch-mediated hypertrophy hit a wall and stops being better for non-novice lifters? Doth the stretch runneth out on us? Greg, do you want to take this one first?
You know this area of the research better than I do. Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's one of those things where, like, I personally think no, it's fine. Like as we discussed before, like training at longer muscle lengths seems to lead to greater increases in fascicle length and pennation angle. So probably more radial and longitudinal hypertrophy. And if that's the case, then the delta of like the difference between longer and shorter muscle length training, like the rates of gains achieved by both of them, you might expect them to start getting closer over time if the increases in fascicle length do eventually run out, which like I suspect that they would. Like I don't see a reason why they wouldn't. Like I do think eventually you would wind up not having a sufficient stimulus to like be telling your muscles to adapt and continue lengthening. And I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's something we don't even need research for. Like logically, a lot of people have been squatting deep for a long time, and if their fascicle length, if they kept adding like more and more sarcomeres in series, eventually you would just wind up in a spot where, just at 90 degrees of knee flexion, like your sarcomeres are already like fully contracted. Like just logically, if you just kept adding more and more and more and more and more, like at some point, the functional range of motion you move your joints through would become like too short of muscle lengths for optimal function. And we don't see that. Therefore, I feel pretty confident that the fascicle length adaptations stop at some point or slow way down. And so, yeah, if the increases in muscle size, like increases in rates of muscle growth we see with longer muscle length training are due to both larger increases in fascicle length and pennation angle, then when those fascicle length adaptations run out, you would expect longer and shorter muscle length training to lead to closer, like more similar rates of hypertrophy. But if we're also seeing larger increases, like larger changes in pennation angle with longer muscle length training, you would, I think, still expect it to generally lead to faster gains over time. I suspect. So, I think that the fascicle length related adaptations would probably run out over time, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that training at longer muscle lengths wouldn't continue to be somewhat advantageous, but it would potentially imply that the advantages associated with it would get progressively smaller over time. That's kind of what I think. And also there's not a ton of research on more well-trained lifters at this point. So I think the best we can do right now is kind of like logic our way through it. And that's where my logic lands me. But I am an empiricist, not a rationalist. And so I don't have a ton of confidence in any of the stuff I just said. That's what I think. That is my hypothesis. but I'm not going to feel super confident about anything until there's more data.
Nice. That is a solid take. I would largely echo those sentiments regarding the research. I think essentially the argument being made here is that I'm trying not to strawman it here, so I'll try and keep it very, very to the point. Essentially, the argument being made is that lengthened training causes increases in fascicle length, and that is the primary or only benefit being achieved through lengthened training versus shortened training. And as we discussed earlier, an increase in fiber length or fascicle length, as we often measure it, is one of the types of hypertrophy, right? Or specifically the addition of sarcomeres in series. And so, with that being the assumed mechanism underlying the benefit of longer muscle length training, if that adaptation essentially ceases occurring after 6 months, then the benefit of lengthened training for hypertrophy also ceases to exist. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. One, the assumption that is baked in there is that the only benefit stems from increases in fascicle length. And as we reviewed earlier, there is also evidence of consistently greater increases in pennation angle. The amount of additional radial hypertrophy or greater increase in pennation angle isn't quite as large as the additional increase in fascicle length or potential longitudinal hypertrophy, but nevertheless, it doesn't seem like fascicle length increases are the only thing that is happening with lengthened training versus more shortened training from the evidence we have. And if you'd like a breakdown of all the studies on that, again, check out the full article to read up on that. But to make a long story short, that assumption does not seem to be substantiated. And then to kind of touch a bit more on the assumption that after 6 months of training, your fascicle length adaptations have essentially maxed out and are plateaued, and you're no longer going to gain additional increase in fascicle length. The evidence on that is relatively mixed. So there are a few studies looking at the timeline of increases in fascicle length, finding that fascicle length increases are most extreme in the first few weeks of a lot of intervention studies, like at least 3 that I can think of that measure fascicle length adaptations at several time points throughout a training intervention, so not just before and after, find that the rate of increase in fascicle length kind of slows down over time. And in some studies, after like 2 to 5 weeks or so, you don't see an additional increase in fascicle length anymore from that given intervention. Now, importantly, these studies often don't use the sort of protocols that we would use in practice, so it's difficult to say whether that generalizes. And also importantly, we have at least 3 studies that I'm aware of otherwise that do find substantial increases in fascicle length even after that 5-week time point. So there's a study by Baroni and colleagues that found this. There's a couple of studies in highly trained elite throwing athletes, both in, for example, one study by Anusaki and colleagues that looked only at male throwers who had an average 100 max squat of 4 plates, aka 405 or 180 kilograms, who in their 25-week training macrocycle, trained population who presumably wouldn't benefit from increases in fascicle length anymore or wouldn't observe those, did still see increases in fascicle length during one phase of their training. And so, alongside another study that broadly found the same thing in a slightly less trained population, but still in highly trained throwing athletes, found increases in fascicle length, there is certainly evidence of even trained populations still observing an increase in fascicle length. So putting aside the fact that the assumption that only fascicle length increases are what is responsible for the greater hypertrophy seen with lengthened training, putting aside the fact that assumption is likely incorrect, the second assumption that increases in fascicle length are very short-lived and only occur within, say, a few weeks or a few months of training. There also is relatively substantial evidence against that claim. So on both assumptions, there is at least evidence to the contrary to a reasonable extent. And so personally, I tend to think that the benefit of lengthened training does still generalize to more trained populations, but we absolutely need more empirical evidence in those populations to somewhat verify, quote unquote, whether or not that is the case. So that's kind of my stance on that. Sound pretty reasonable? Beautiful.
I think so. I mean, yeah. Like I said, I don't know. I am a little less concerned about whether or not we do observe increases in fascicle length with trained lifters, just because, like, I do think one of the assumptions in this question is basically true, that like changes in fascicle length, like that is a finite adaptation. Like if someone is trying to maximally increase fascicle length in the context of resistance training, like that adaptation is going to run out. And so if you're observing increases in fascicle length in trained lifters, that suggests that that is not an adaptation that they had previously maximized. But yeah, I mean, it's not, you don't have unlimited room to run there. Like the functional properties of a muscle do kind of dictate that that's not going to proceed forever. So that is just kind of like the one little note that I would make. Like, yeah, there is some research finding, like, observing increases in fascicle length in trained lifters. But in terms of like kind of making assumptions about and projecting adaptations to longer versus shorter muscle length training over time, I don't know that I care about it that much.
Sure.
Because like you are going to tap out that adaptation at some point.
Sure. So I fully agree that there's a theoretical limit. Now, my quick question to you is going to be, do you think it's kind of like the genetic natural potential limit, or the natty limit, where like there is a theoretical limit, right? But whether or not we are going to achieve it within a few years of lifting or what have you, whether it's not even just asymptotic, wherein you kind of gradually inch towards it and maybe certain forms of training accelerate that process or what have you, do you think it's actually something that people need to worry about? Okay, I've been training with lengthened forms of training for 2 months. It's over. No more benefit.
I mean, not necessarily. I think, I mean, there is a difference between attaining and maintaining adaptations. So, let's just say that you have 10% more total muscle mass now because you've increased all of your fascicle lengths by 10% by doing longer muscle length training. That adaptation occurred because a stimulus was placed upon the muscles. And if you remove the stimulus, you would expect the adaptations to revert, which I don't think would just mean like 10% atrophy overnight, but it might mean that you continue having some radial hypertrophy, but you also gradually have decreases in fascicle length such that like it appears you plateau for a while in terms of total muscle mass, even though like cross-sectional area is increasing. Like, you could have a scenario like that going on. I do think that even after you like fully maximize any fascicle length related adaptations, I do still think that like training through longer muscle lengths seems to be just as good, if not better, at continuing to cause radial hypertrophy. And I think it would likely be necessary to maintain the fascicle length adaptations that you'd achieved. So I do think it would still be beneficial. But I do, I mean, I think that I think that there are kind of two separate questions related to the ability of like what type of limit it would be if there is a limit. I mean, just in terms of the most basic muscle physiology possible, if for instance, like if right now nothing changes about you, but fascicle length for all of the fascicles in your biceps increase twofold, your biceps are useless now. Like the resting length of the muscle would be at such a short per sarcomere length that you wouldn't be able to contract and like produce elbow flexion. Like it would make the muscle useless. And if tension is important as a growth stimulus at all, you would need to be able to like continue generating some tension. So I don't think fascicle length is going to keep. And I mean, using the biceps as an example again, even outside of a resistance training context, I don't know how you would possibly stretch your arm, like stretch your biceps enough to cause that large of a fascicle length adaptation in the first place. Here's a crazy idea. You do see increases in fascicle length and sarcomeres in series when people do like limb lengthening stuff. Well, I say when like animals do limb lengthening stuff. I'm sure it happens in people as well, but whatever. Again, can't kill research subjects. Can kill research rabbits. But yeah, so let's just say theoretically, you gradually over a period of years get more and more and more limb lengthening surgery done on like your femur, and now it's twice the length. Your quads and hamstrings have like stretched out along with it. That's like an extreme scenario, but I don't see a reason to suspect that your fascicles, like your fibers, couldn't keep getting longer and longer and longer to accommodate the longer bone. Like it would be gradual adaptations. You couldn't do it all at once, but like I do think that would occur. So like in the strictest sense of the word, I don't think that it's like the quote unquote genetic limit for hypertrophy. I do think that if the intensity of the stimulus could be maintained, I do think functionally, if you could do something insane like that, like more and more and more limb lengthening, I do think that muscle fiber length could continue increasing more and more and more and more. Like I don't think that it's that sort of limit where if you could maintain a sufficient stimulus, I think it could keep getting longer. But without that sort of, again, just absolutely wonky stimulus, I don't think it's going to happen. Because most practically in a resistance training context, you're going to be limited by like what ranges of motion you can train through in like normal exercises. And even beyond that, if you're trying to like absolutely tap it out with like the craziest like just stretching interventions, even not under load, where you're trying to get as flexible as like a gymnast or like a ballet dancer or whatever, eventually you're going to be tapped out by just pure constraints of joint architecture, where like, you can only stretch your quads but so much, because at some point your tibia is hitting your femur, and the muscles on the backside of your leg are like compressing. Like there are finite constraints on how much you can stretch a muscle to cause further increases in fascicle length. So I think that without some sort of like completely wonky intervention, I do think it's like a hard asymptote where you, past a certain point, you just aren't going to be able to like create enough stimulus to cause further adaptation. But I think if you could maintain the stimulus, again, like progressive limb lengthening, I do think it could adapt forever. So I think it's both similar and dissimilar.
Sure. No, that makes a ton of sense. I guess
I think it's practically similar and theoretically dissimilar.
Is it not the opposite? Oh, sorry, my brain had to think there for a second.
Practically similar in that there's a quote-unquote genetic limit, practically.
Oh,
and there's
gotcha.
a finite degree to which fascicle length can increase
dissimilar
practically.
With surgery.
But theoretically, it's different, because if you could maintain some sort of like crazy stimulus, I do think it could keep getting longer and longer.
Sure, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that about wraps up the Q&A section. So at this point, the only thing that remains to be done, I think, is for Greg to wrap us out.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Stronger by Science podcast. You could have been doing anything with this time. You could have been listening to anything, and we're so glad and so honored that you chose to spend it with us. We'll be back in another couple of weeks with another episode. And until then, hope you have a good fortnight. Hope your training's going well. Hope life's treating you well. And we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.
Peace.